They said Eleanor Ashford died in the train wreck of 1843. They buried an empty coffin. They forgot her name. But on Christmas Eve, 1848, she walked through the doors of Blackthorne Manor, alive, draped in widow's black, holding the hand of a boy who wasn't hers by birth. The ballroom fell silent. Champagne glasses froze midair, and Duke Adrian Blackthorne, the man who had searched for her until his hands bled, stared at the ghost he'd mourned for 5 years. This is the story of a woman society wanted buried twice, and the war she fought to prove them all wrong. Stay until the end to see how she won. Drop a like and comment which city you're watching from. The first snowfall of December came early to Blackthorne Manor, blanketing the ancient estate in a silence so complete it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. Inside the grand hall, 200 candles burned in crystal chandeliers, casting dancing shadows across walls hung with portraits of stern-faced ancestors who seemed to judge the living with cold, painted eyes. The Duke's annual Christmas ball was the event of the season, an evening when England's highest nobility gathered to see and be seen, to whisper scandals behind silk fans, and to pretend that their carefully constructed world was built on something more solid than gossip and gold. Duke Adrian Blackthorne stood at the top of the marble staircase, watching the glittering crowd below with the detached air of a man who had long ago stopped finding pleasure in such gatherings. At 32, he cut an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair touched by premature silver at the temples and eyes the color of winter storms. His evening coat was tailored to perfection, his cravat tied with mathematical precision, but there was something hollow in his expression, as if he were merely playing the role of host while his real self existed somewhere far away. "Your Grace looks positively morose," Lady Pemberton observed, gliding up beside him with a rustle of emerald silk. She was a widow of a certain age, known for her sharp tongue and sharper political instincts. "One would think you were attending a funeral rather than hosting a celebration." Adrian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Perhaps I am, Lady Pemberton. We all wear our mourning in different ways." She studied him with eyes that had witnessed 4 decades of aristocratic intrigue. "It's been 5 years, Your Grace. 5 years since the Ashford girl died in that dreadful accident. At some point, even grief must yield to practicality. Your duty to the duchy—" "My duty," Adrian interrupted quietly, "is a matter for me alone to determine." Before Lady Pemberton could formulate a suitably cutting response, the massive oak doors at the entrance swung open, admitting a blast of winter air that made the candles flicker and sent a shiver through the assembled guests. A footman stepped forward to announce the new arrival, but the words died on his lips. His face went chalk white. The silver tray he carried clattered to the marble floor. Every head in the ballroom turned toward the entrance. A woman stood in the doorway, framed by swirling snow and darkness. She wore a gown of deepest black, mourning clothes of the finest quality, but mourning nonetheless, that seemed to absorb the candlelight rather than reflect it. Her hair, the color of autumn chestnuts, was pulled back severely from a face that was striking rather than conventionally beautiful. High cheekbones, a straight nose, and eyes the shade of honey that caught and held the light. There was something otherworldly about her stillness, as if she had stepped out of a painting or a dream. But it was the child beside her that broke the spell of silence. A boy, no more than 5 years old, clung to her gloved hand with both of his own. He had dark curls and solemn eyes that swept the room with the wariness of a small animal surveying unfamiliar territory. His clothes were well made but simple, and he pressed close to the woman's skirts as if they were the only safe harbor in a hostile sea. The whispers began like wind through dry leaves. "It cannot be. Eleanor Ashford died 5 years ago. The train wreck. Impossible." Adrian's world tilted on its axis. He gripped the marble balustrade so hard his knuckles went white. His heart, which had beaten with mechanical regularity for 5 years, suddenly remembered how to race. The blood drained from his face, then rushed back in a hot flood that made his vision swim. Eleanor. It was impossible. He had searched the wreckage of the Manchester-London Express for 3 days straight, refusing to sleep, refusing to eat, climbing through twisted metal and shattered wood until his hands were raw and bleeding. He had questioned every survivor, pursued every rumor, followed every lead across half of England. And when the official list of the dead was finally published, her name had been there in black ink: Miss Eleanor Catherine Ashford, age 22, no remains recovered. He had attended her memorial service at St. Paul's Cathedral. He had stood beside her father, now long dead himself, and listened to the vicar speak empty words about God's mysterious ways and eternal rest. He had watched them lower an empty coffin into the frozen ground while sleet fell like tears from an indifferent sky. And yet she stood before him now, solid and real, her chest rising and falling with breath, her hand warm and alive as it held the child's. Lady Pemberton's sharp intake of breath brought Adrian back to himself. All around the ballroom, the carefully maintained facade of aristocratic composure was cracking. Women clutched their fans. Men stood frozen with champagne glasses halfway to their lips. The orchestra had stopped playing, leaving only the crackle of the fireplace and the whisper of shocked voices. Eleanor's gaze swept the room with the cool assessment of a general surveying a battlefield. Then her eyes found Adrian's across the distance, and for a single heartbeat, the 5 years between them collapsed into nothing. He saw recognition flash in those honey-colored depths, followed by something more complicated, pain perhaps, or regret, or the ghost of feelings that should have died with her. She did not smile. She did not bow. She simply looked at him with the steady regard of someone who had stared down death itself and found it wanting. "Good evening," Eleanor said, her voice carrying across the silent ballroom with bell-like clarity. "I apologize for the dramatic entrance. I seem to have that effect lately." Lord Hastings, a portly man with mutton-chop whiskers and more courage than sense, stepped forward. "Madam, you cannot be Eleanor Ashford. Miss Ashford perished in the Manchester disaster of 1843. We attended her memorial. We saw her, that is, we mourned her properly." "You mourned an empty box, Lord Hastings," Eleanor replied evenly. "I'm afraid reports of my death were, while understandable, somewhat premature." "But where have you been? Why did you not—" Hastings sputtered like a damp firecracker. Adrian found his legs and began descending the staircase. The crowd parted before him like the Red Sea before Moses, and he was distantly aware that every eye in the room was now fixed on him, waiting to see how the Duke would react to this impossible resurrection. He stopped 3 feet from Eleanor, close enough to confirm that she was real, flesh and blood and bone, not some fever dream conjured by too much brandy and too many lonely nights, close enough to catch the faint scent of lavender and something else, something sharp and medicinal that spoke of recent hardship. "Eleanor," he said, and was surprised his voice didn't crack on her name. "Your Grace," she replied, dropping into a curtsy that was technically correct but somehow mocking in its precision. The child beside her attempted to bow and nearly toppled over. Eleanor steadied him with a gentle hand. 5 years, Adrian said quietly, aware that 200 pairs of ears were straining to catch every word. 5 years without a word, without a letter, without any sign that you lived. Something flickered behind Eleanor's eyes. Shame, perhaps, or pain, but her voice remained steady. "I had my reasons, Your Grace. Reasons I'm prepared to explain, though perhaps not to an audience of quite this size." "You owe us all an explanation," Lady Pemberton interjected sharply, having recovered her equilibrium. "You cannot simply return from the grave and expect society to welcome you with open arms. There are questions, proprieties, standards that must be maintained." Eleanor turned to face the older woman with a look that could have frozen champagne. "I owe society nothing, Lady Pemberton. Absolutely nothing. I survived a train wreck that killed 47 people. I lost my memory for 3 months. I was taken in by strangers, nursed back to health, and eventually found my way to a new life. A life that included marriage and motherhood and all the things society claims to value above all else." She gestured to the child, who pressed even closer to her skirts. "This is Thomas. He is 5 years old. His father was Jonathan Hartley, a railway investor who died 6 months ago. Before he died, he made me promise to protect Thomas from relatives who see him only as an obstacle to an inheritance. I have returned to England to honor that promise, regardless of what society thinks of me." The whispers exploded like a flock of startled birds. She married a railway man. How convenient. Probably trapped him on his deathbed. Adrian held up one hand, and the room fell silent with the automatic obedience trained into aristocrats from birth. When a duke spoke, even the walls listened. "These are not matters to be discussed in a ballroom," he said firmly. "Eleanor, Miss Ashford, Mrs. Hartley." He stumbled over what to call this woman who had been so many things to him. "You and the child must be exhausted from your journey. Blackthorne Manor has more than enough rooms to accommodate you both. We will speak privately once you've had time to rest and recover." "That is most generous, Your Grace," Eleanor said, and there was genuine gratitude beneath the formal words. "But I don't wish to impose. I have taken rooms at the King's Arms in the village." "The King's Arms is no place for a lady and a child," Adrian cut her off. "Especially not on Christmas Eve. I insist. As your—" He hesitated, then finished quietly. "As your friend, Eleanor. Whatever else has happened, we were friends once. Let me offer you the courtesy I would extend to any friend in need." Eleanor's throat worked as she swallowed. For the first time since entering the ballroom, her composure cracked just slightly. "Very well, Your Grace. We accept your kind offer." "Splendid," Lady Pemberton said with acid sweetness. "How touching, though one does wonder what the Hartley family will make of the Duke sheltering their deceased relative's widow. I understand there are some rather ugly legal proceedings underway regarding the child's inheritance." Eleanor's spine stiffened. "Indeed there are, Lady Pemberton. Jonathan's cousins, led by his charming brother Marcus, have filed suit to have me declared an unfit guardian. They claim I manipulated a dying man to steal his fortune. The hearing is scheduled for early February." "Well," Lady Pemberton continued, fanning herself with theatrical vigor, "one can hardly blame them for being suspicious. You appear from nowhere with a convenient marriage certificate and a child who stands between them and a considerable railway fortune. It does strain credibility." "Perhaps," Eleanor agreed coolly, "but then so does a woman returning from the dead. I seem to specialize in the improbable, Lady Pemberton." Adrian stepped between them before the exchange could escalate further. "This is neither the time nor the place. Mrs. Jennings," he called to his housekeeper, who had been watching the scene unfold with wide eyes from the servants' entrance. "Please prepare the rose room for Mrs. Hartley and the adjoining nursery for the boy. See that they have everything they need, hot water, food, fresh linens, whatever they require." Mrs. Jennings bobbed a curtsy, her face a careful mask of professional neutrality. "At once, Your Grace." Eleanor gathered Thomas closer, preparing to follow the housekeeper. But before she could take a step, a voice rang out from the crowd, male, cultured, and dripping with contempt. "How extraordinary that the Duke should take such a personal interest in your welfare, Mrs. Hartley. One might almost think there was some history between you." Adrian turned to find Sir Edmund Vale stepping forward, resplendent in a burgundy evening coat that matched his florid complexion. Vale was a minor baronet with major ambitions, known for his skill at gathering and weaponizing gossip. He smiled like a shark that had just tasted blood in the water. "Sir Edmund," Adrian said flatly, "you overstep." "Do I?" Vale's smile widened. "Forgive me, Your Grace, but the entire ballroom is thinking it. 5 years ago, before the tragic accident, you and Miss Ashford were seen together quite frequently. There were even rumors of an understanding between you, and now she returns, mysteriously alive, with a child and a convenient dead husband, and you immediately offer her shelter under your roof." He spread his hands in mock innocence. One does wonder what conclusions society might draw. The ballroom had gone so quiet that the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner sounded like a heartbeat. Adrian descended the final 2 steps until he stood face to face with Vale. Though they were of equal height, Adrian's presence made the other man seem to shrink. "Society," Adrian said softly, "may draw whatever conclusions it wishes. I learned long ago that I cannot control what people think or say. What I can control is my own actions. And I choose to offer hospitality to a woman who was once dear to me and who now finds herself in difficult circumstances. If that offends your sensibilities, Sir Edmund, you are welcome to take your leave." Vale's smile faltered. "I meant no offense, Your Grace. You were merely demonstrating why I rarely attend social gatherings anymore," Adrian interrupted. "They tend to bring out the worst in people. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have guests to attend to." He offered his arm to Eleanor, who took it after a moment's hesitation. Her touch was light, barely there, but Adrian felt it like a brand through the layers of evening clothes. Together they walked toward the grand staircase, the child trailing behind like a small shadow. Behind them, the whispers rose to a roar. Scandal of the century. The nerve of her. Completely inappropriate. Always knew Blackthorne had a weakness for that girl. Adrian ignored it all. He had spent 5 years learning to ignore things. The emptiness of his bed, the silence of his dining room, the way hope died a little more each day until he had stopped believing in it entirely. What was a little more gossip compared to that? They climbed the staircase in silence. Eleanor's hand remained on his arm, steady and warm, and Adrian found himself cataloging the ways she had changed. There were fine lines at the corners of her eyes that hadn't been there before. Her shoulders were broader, more squared, as if she had learned to carry weight he couldn't imagine. And there was a hardness to her jaw, a set to her mouth, that spoke of battles fought and won in the years she had been gone. She was not the girl he had loved. That girl had been softer, quicker to laugh, full of dreams about art and music and travel. This woman was something else entirely, something tempered by fire and loss into steel, and he found to his surprise that he wanted to know her even more. Mrs. Jennings met them at the top of the stairs, bustling and efficient despite the unprecedented nature of the situation. "The rooms are being prepared now, Your Grace. I've sent for hot cocoa and biscuits for the young gentleman, and a proper supper for Mrs. Hartley." "Thank you, Mrs. Jennings," Eleanor said warmly. "You're very kind." The housekeeper's professional mask slipped just slightly, revealing genuine sympathy beneath. "We all remember you, miss. That is, Mrs. Hartley. It's good to see you well." Eleanor's eyes grew bright, and Adrian realized with a jolt that she was fighting tears. "Thank you," she whispered. Mrs. Jennings cleared her throat and addressed Thomas with exaggerated cheer. "Now then, young sir, I'll bet you've never seen a nursery quite like the one we have here. There's a rocking horse that's been waiting for a rider for 20 years, and a whole shelf of toy soldiers just gathering dust. What do you say we go have a look while your mother gets settled?" Thomas looked up at Eleanor with wide, uncertain eyes. She knelt down, bringing herself to his level, and brushed a curl back from his forehead with infinite tenderness. "It's all right, darling," she murmured. "Mrs. Jennings will take very good care of you. I'll be right next door, and I'll come check on you before you fall asleep. I promise." "Will the people downstairs come up here?" Thomas asked in a small voice. Eleanor's expression hardened. "Not if they value their lives, sweetheart. You're safe here. The Duke has promised us protection, and a Duke's promise is not given lightly." Thomas considered this with the seriousness of a child who had learned too young that the world was not always kind. Finally, he nodded and took Mrs. Jennings' offered hand. The housekeeper led him down the corridor, chattering about the rocking horse and the toy soldiers, her voice fading into the distance. And then Adrian and Eleanor were alone in the hallway, with 5 years of silence stretching between them like an ocean. "You didn't have to do this," Eleanor said quietly. "Take us in, I mean. I know what it will cost you, the gossip, the speculation, the damage to your reputation." Adrian laughed, a harsh sound with no humor in it. "My reputation has been damaged beyond repair since the day you died, Eleanor. Or rather, since the day I thought you died. I spent 3 months searching for you like a madman. I neglected my duties. I ignored the estate. I drove myself to this edge of collapse. Society has been whispering about my unsound judgment ever since." "Adrian, don't," he said, holding up a hand. "Don't apologize. Don't explain, not yet. I've had 5 years of questions burning in my chest like coals, but I'm not going to demand answers from you tonight. You're exhausted. You're frightened for the child. And He trailed off, not sure how to finish that sentence. Eleanor studied his face with those honey-colored eyes that had haunted his dreams. "And you?" she prompted gently. "And I need time," Adrian admitted. "Time to accept that you're real. Time to understand what it means that you're here. Time to remember how to feel something other than grief." She reached out and touched his hand, just briefly, just the brush of fingertips against his knuckles, but it sent electricity racing up his arm. "I'm sorry," she said, "for all of it, for disappearing, for not finding a way to contact you, for coming back like this, bringing chaos with me. I'm sorry. Tell me one thing, Adrian said, catching her hand before she could pull away. Just one thing tonight, and then I'll let you rest. What do you want to know? Did you love him? Your husband? Jonathan Hartley? Did you love him? Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, and Adrian braced himself for an answer that would shatter something inside him. But when she finally spoke, her voice was gentle and sad. I cared for him deeply, she said. He was kind to me when I had nothing and no one. He gave me a home and a purpose when I didn't even remember my own name. He asked nothing of me except that I love his son, which was the easiest promise I've ever made. She met Adrian's eyes directly. But did I love him the way I once loved you? No. That kind of love only comes once in a lifetime, Adrian, and I already spent mine. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with everything unsaid. Adrian released her hand and stepped back, needing distance before he did something foolish like pulling her into his arms and never letting go. Good night, Eleanor, he managed. Sleep well. We'll talk in the morning. Good night, Your Grace. She walked away down the corridor, her black morning gown whispering against the carpet, and Adrian stood alone in the hallway with his heart beating like it hadn't in 5 years. Below, in the ballroom, the orchestra had resumed playing, but the music was muted and subdued. The guests would be dissecting every moment of the evening, constructing narratives and theories, sharpening their judgments like knives. Let them talk, Adrian thought. Let them whisper and speculate and condemn. He had spent 5 years in a kind of living death, going through the motions of life without truly living. And now, impossibly, miraculously, Eleanor had returned. Whatever came next, whatever battles lay ahead, whatever price society demanded, he would face it gladly. Because for the first time since that terrible day in 1843, Adrian Blackthorne felt alive. The Rose Room lived up to its name, with wallpaper patterned in delicate pink roses and curtains of cream silk that puddled on the floor like spilled milk. A fire had been lit in the marble fireplace, filling the room with warmth and the comforting scent of burning oak. A copper bathtub steamed in the corner, and someone had laid out a nightgown of soft white cotton that looked like it might have belonged to Adrian's mother or sister. Eleanor stood in the center of the room, trembling. Now that she was alone, now that she no longer had to maintain the facade of strength, the enormity of what she had done crashed over her like a wave. She had walked into a ballroom full of England's highest nobility and announced her return from the dead. She had stood before Adrian, beautiful, heartbroken Adrian, and seen the ghost of their lost love reflected in his storm-gray eyes. And she had brought Thomas into the center of a scandal that could destroy them both. A soft knock at the door made her turn. "Come in," she called, hastily wiping at her eyes. A young maid entered carrying a tray laden with food. "Begging your pardon, ma'am, but Mrs. Jennings sent up some supper. She thought you might be hungry." The smell of roasted chicken and fresh bread made Eleanor's stomach clench with sudden, desperate hunger. She realized she hadn't eaten since breakfast, and that had been only a hard roll and weak tea at the coaching inn. "Thank you," she said, her voice rough. "That's very thoughtful." The maid set the tray on a small table by the fire and bobbed a curtsy. She was perhaps 16, with freckles across her nose and kind eyes. "Will there be anything else, ma'am?" "What's your name?" Eleanor asked. "Annie, ma'am." "Well, Annie, I wonder if you might do me a kindness. Could you check on Thomas, the little boy in the nursery? Make sure he's comfortable and not too frightened?" Annie's expression softened. "Oh, don't you worry, ma'am. I just came from there. Mrs. Jennings has him all tucked up in bed with a hot water bottle and 3 blankets. He was asking for you, but she told him you'd be in to kiss him goodnight once you'd had a chance to wash and eat. He's a sweet little lad, if I may say so." Relief flooded through Eleanor. "Thank you, Annie. Truly." After the maid left, Eleanor forced herself to eat mechanically, barely tasting the food. Her mind was racing too fast to appreciate the excellent cooking. She kept seeing Adrian's face when he'd recognized her, the shock, the pain, the terrible hope that had flared in his eyes like a candle lit in a dark room. She had not expected it to hurt so much to see him again. She had told herself, during the long journey south from Yorkshire, that 5 years was enough time to heal any wound. She had built a life without him, had married another man, raised another man's child, learned to find purpose in duty rather than passion. She had buried the girl she'd been beneath layers of pragmatism and responsibility. But the moment she'd met Adrian's eyes across that ballroom, all those carefully constructed defenses had crumbled like sand. That kind of love only comes once in a lifetime. Why had she said that? It had been cruel, dangling before him the possibility of something they could never have again. She was tainted now, a widow with a questionable past and a child who wasn't hers by blood. Even if Adrian still cared for her, which seemed impossible given how she'd hurt him, society would never accept their union. The Duke of Blackthorne could not marry a woman who had returned from the dead like a character in a Gothic novel. Eleanor finished eating without really tasting anything and then sank into the steaming bathtub. The hot water eased the ache in her muscles but couldn't touch the deeper pain lodged somewhere beneath her ribs. She scrubbed at her skin until it was pink, as if she could wash away the past 5 years and emerge new and clean and worthy of the second chance she didn't deserve. Eventually, she dried off and dressed in the borrowed nightgown. It was too large, made for a taller woman, but it was clean and soft and smelled faintly of lavender. She braided her hair, checked that the door was locked, and then padded barefoot to the connecting door that led to the nursery. Thomas was indeed tucked into a bed that was far too grand for such a small boy, buried beneath quilts like a bird in a nest. His dark curls were spread across a pillow embroidered with the Blackthorne crest, and his eyes were already heavy with sleep. "Mama," he murmured as she sat on the edge of the bed. He had taken to calling her that 6 months ago, shortly before Jonathan died, and Eleanor had never corrected him. What was the point? She was the only mother he would ever know. "I'm here, darling," she said softly, stroking his forehead. "How do you like the nursery?" "It's very big," Thomas said seriously. "Mrs. Jennings showed me the rocking horse. She said it belonged to the Duke when he was a boy." "Did she? Well, perhaps tomorrow you can ride it, if you're very careful." "Mama?" Thomas's eyes searched her face. "Are the people downstairs angry with us?" Eleanor's heart clenched. "Some of them are confused, sweetheart, and people often respond to confusion with anger. But it's not really about us. It's about them and their own fears. Do you understand?" Thomas thought about this. Papa used to say that people are afraid of what they don't understand. "Your papa was a wise man," Eleanor said gently. Jonathan had been many things, practical, methodical, occasionally stubborn, but he had possessed a quiet wisdom that she'd come to value deeply. "Do you miss him?" Thomas asked. "Every day," Eleanor answered truthfully, "just as I know you do." "I miss him," Thomas confirmed, his voice small. "But I'm glad I have you. Will Uncle Marcus really try to take me away?" Eleanor's jaw tightened. Marcus Hartley was Jonathan's younger brother, a man whose ambition exceeded his intelligence and whose cruelty was matched only by his greed. He had made it clear from the moment of Jonathan's death that he considered Thomas's inheritance rightfully his. "He will try," Eleanor said carefully, "but I will fight him with everything I have. You are my son in all the ways that matter, Thomas, and I will not let anyone take you from me. Do you believe me?" Thomas nodded against his pillow. "The Duke seems nice. Will he help us?" "I think he will," Eleanor said, though the words felt like sand on her tongue. She didn't want to rely on Adrian, didn't want to drag him further into the mess she'd made of her life. But she was out of options and almost out of hope. "Good," Thomas said, his eyes drifting closed. "I like it here. It feels safe." Eleanor stayed until his breathing evened out into the deep rhythm of sleep, then kissed his forehead and returned to her own room. She stood at the window, looking out over the moonlit grounds of Blackthorne Manor. The snow had stopped falling, and the world was hushed in silver, beautiful in the way that only winter nights can be. Somewhere in this vast house, Adrian was probably still awake, wrestling with his own demons. She wondered if he was thinking of her. She wondered if he hated her for coming back. She wondered if she would survive the coming storm, and if Thomas would emerge from it unscathed. So many questions, and the only certain answer was that tomorrow would bring more battles, more judgments, more impossible choices. But for tonight, in this borrowed room with her borrowed child sleeping safely next door, Eleanor allowed herself a moment of peace. It might be the last one she would have for a very long time. Morning came too soon, pale winter light filtering through the curtains like watered milk. Eleanor woke to the sound of Thomas's laughter drifting through the connecting door, a sound so rare and precious that she lay still for a moment just listening to it. Then voices joined in, deeper and unfamiliar, and she bolted upright with her heart hammering. She threw on a dressing gown and rushed into the nursery to find Thomas perched on the legendary rocking horse, gripping its carved mane with both hands while Adrian stood beside him, one steadying hand on the boy's back. "Higher, your grace," Thomas crowed, rocking with more enthusiasm than skill. "Make it go higher." "Any higher and you'll launch yourself into the rafters," Adrian said, but there was warmth in his voice that Eleanor had never heard before, something gentle and almost tender. He looked different in the morning light, dressed casually in shirt sleeves and a simple waistcoat, his dark hair slightly disheveled as if he'd run his hands through it. He looked younger, less like a duke and more like a man. Then he noticed Eleanor in the doorway and straightened immediately, his expression shifting back into careful neutrality. "Good morning. I apologize for intruding. I heard noise and wanted to ensure everything was well." "Everything is fine," Eleanor said, tightening the belt of her dressing gown and acutely aware that her hair was loose and unbrushed. "Thomas, darling, you should let His Grace return to his breakfast. I'm sure he has important matters to attend to." "Actually," Adrian said, "I was hoping you might both join me. We have a great deal to discuss, and it's best done over a proper meal." The formality had returned to his voice, but something in his eyes remained soft when he looked at Thomas. Eleanor recognized that look. It was the way people gazed at children when they reminded them of something lost or longed for. "We would be delighted," she heard herself say, though her stomach was knotted with anxiety. "Give me 20 minutes to make myself presentable." "Take your time. I'll have Mrs. Jennings send up hot water." Adrian lifted Thomas down from the rocking horse with easy strength. "And you, young man, should probably wash your face before presenting yourself at the breakfast table. You appear to have chocolate biscuit from last night smeared on your chin." Thomas giggled and scrubbed at his face with his sleeve, and Eleanor felt something crack inside her chest. This was dangerous, allowing Thomas to become attached to Adrian, allowing herself to soften toward the man she'd spent 5 years trying to forget. But what choice did she have? 25 minutes later, dressed in a simple gray day dress borrowed from the manor's apparently extensive collection of ladies' clothing, Eleanor descended the grand staircase with Thomas's hand in hers. A footman directed them to a small breakfast room overlooking the east garden, where Adrian sat reading the Times and drinking coffee that smelled like heaven. He rose immediately when they entered. "Please, sit. I've had cook prepare everything. Eggs, bacon, toast, kippers, porridge. I wasn't sure what the boy would eat." "Thomas will eat whatever is put in front of him," Eleanor said, settling her son into a chair and beginning to fill his plate. "He's learned not to be particular." Adrian's eyes sharpened at that comment, but he said nothing, instead pouring Eleanor a cup of tea that he somehow prepared exactly as she'd always taken it. 2 sugars, a splash of milk. The fact that he remembered after 5 years made her throat tight. They ate in awkward silence for a few minutes, punctuated only by the clink of silverware and Thomas's occasional questions about the paintings on the walls. Then Adrian set down his fork and met Eleanor's eyes directly. "We need to discuss the legal situation," he said quietly, "and we need to do it before the gossip from last night spreads any further. I took the liberty of sending for my solicitor. He'll arrive this afternoon." Eleanor's hand froze halfway to her teacup. "Adrian, I cannot ask you to—" "You're not asking, I'm offering." His voice was firm, but not unkind. "Eleanor, you walked into a ballroom full of vipers last night and painted a target on your back. Marcus Hartley and his cousins will use every weapon at their disposal to take that boy from you, and your return from the dead has just handed them a dozen new ones. You need help, legal help, financial help, and unfortunately, social help. I can provide all 3. "At what cost to yourself?" Eleanor demanded, keeping her voice low so Thomas wouldn't hear the edge in it. "You're already being talked about. By this afternoon, every drawing room in London will be speculating about the nature of our relationship. They'll say I've come back to trap you into marriage. They'll say you're sheltering me because we were lovers before I disappeared. They'll—" "Let them say whatever they want," Adrian interrupted. "I stopped caring about society's opinion of me the day I dug through train wreckage with my bare hands. What I care about is that you're here, you're in trouble, and I have the resources to help, unless—" He paused, and something vulnerable flickered across his face. "Unless you don't want my help. If you'd prefer to handle this on your own, I'll respect that decision." Eleanor looked at Thomas, who was carefully spreading jam on his toast with the intense concentration of a small child performing an important task. He had jam on his nose. His cuffs needed mending. He was everything good in her life, and she would walk through fire to protect him. "I want your help," she admitted quietly. "I'm terrified to accept it, but I want it, for Thomas's sake." "Then it's settled." Adrian's shoulders relaxed slightly. "Now tell me everything. Start with the train wreck and don't leave anything out. I need to understand what we're up against." So Eleanor told him. She told him about waking up in a farmer's cottage 3 months after the accident with no memory of her own name. She told him about the kindly doctor who'd treated her injuries and the village women who'd nursed her back to health. She told him about Jonathan Hartley appearing one day, a railway investor traveling through the area, who'd recognized her from a missing persons notice and gently helped her piece together fragments of her past. "But my memory never fully returned," she said, staring into her teacup. "Even now, there are gaps. I remember my childhood, my father, my education. I remember London society and the season, and—" She glanced up at Adrian, then away. "I remember you, but the accident itself and the weeks surrounding it are just gone. The doctors said it sometimes happens with head trauma." "Jonathan Hartley helped you," Adrian prompted, his voice carefully neutral. "He did more than help me. He gave me a life when I had nothing." Eleanor's voice strengthened. His wife had died giving birth to Thomas 18 months earlier. He was drowning in grief and didn't know how to care for an infant. I was drowning in confusion and didn't know who I was. We found each other, I suppose. He offered me employment as Thomas's nurse, and I accepted. And then you married him. 2 years later, yes. He was dying even then. His heart was failing, the doctors said, and he wanted to ensure Thomas would be protected. His brother Marcus had already begun circling like a vulture, making comments about taking the boy for his own good. Jonathan knew what that meant. Marcus would drain the estate and send Thomas off to some boarding school where he'd be forgotten. Adrian's jaw tightened. "So Hartley married you to make you the boy's legal guardian?" "It was a practical arrangement," Eleanor said defensively. "But also I cared for him deeply, Adrian. He was a good man, a kind man. He deserved better than to die alone and frightened for his son's future." "I'm not judging you," Adrian said softly. "I'm trying to understand. What happened after he died?" Marcus showed up at the funeral with a solicitor in tow. He had papers declaring me an unfit guardian based on my questionable background and mysterious past. He's claiming that I manipulated Jonathan into marriage while he was mentally incapacitated by illness. The judge granted a hearing for February 5th, 6 weeks from now, to determine Thomas's custody. "On what grounds does Marcus claim unfitness?" Eleanor's laugh was bitter. "Pick your poison. I have no family connections, no property of my own, no references prior to my employment with Jonathan. I'm a woman who appeared from nowhere with convenient amnesia and a marriage certificate. Marcus's lawyers have painted me as either an opportunistic fortune hunter or a woman of such low character that my past had to be invented wholesale." Adrian was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the table. Finally he said, "They can't win on those grounds alone. You were legally married to Jonathan Hartley. The marriage produced no children of your own, which actually works in your favor. It proves you weren't trying to produce an heir to steal the inheritance. And Thomas is old enough to express his own preferences, which carries weight with the courts." "You seem well versed in custody law," Eleanor observed. "I've had occasion to study it," Adrian said vaguely. "The point is, Marcus needs more than speculation to take Thomas from you. He needs proof of actual unfitness, evidence of neglect, abuse, immorality, mental incapacity. Does he have anything like that?" "Not that I know of, but Adrian—" Eleanor leaned forward, her voice dropping even lower. "He doesn't need proof if he can simply destroy my character completely. And my appearance at your Christmas ball just handed him the ammunition he needs. By now, the story of my dramatic return from the dead is spreading across England. Marcus will use it to paint me as unhinged, attention-seeking, possibly even criminal. He'll say I faked my own death to escape scandal. He'll dig up every rumor about you and me from 5 years ago and twist it into evidence of loose morals. Then we'll counter with the truth," Adrian said firmly. "We'll present medical testimony about your amnesia. We'll provide character witnesses who can attest to your devotion to Thomas. will demonstrate that you've been a loving, capable guardian for years. And if necessary, he hesitated, then plunged forward. If necessary, I will testify on your behalf. As a duke, my word carries considerable weight. No, Eleanor said immediately. Absolutely not. Adrian, if you testify for me, it will only confirm every ugly rumor. They'll say we're colluding. They'll say you're protecting me because we're lovers. It will destroy any credibility I have left. Or, Adrian countered, it will show that a man of unimpeachable reputation believes in your character strongly enough to stake his own name on it. Eleanor, I understand your concerns, but you're fighting with one hand tied behind your back. Let me help. Let me give you every advantage. Before Eleanor could respond, the breakfast room door opened and Mrs. Jennings appeared, her face pale and troubled. Your Grace, forgive the interruption, but there are visitors. Adrian frowned. At this hour? Who? Mr. Marcus Hartley and his solicitor, Your Grace. They say they have urgent business with Mrs. Hartley and will not be put off. I've shown them to the library. The blood drained from Eleanor's face. He's here. Already. How did he even know? The gossip from last night traveled faster than we anticipated, Adrian said grimly, rising to his feet. It's barely 8 o'clock and he's already at my door. That tells me he's been waiting for an opportunity like this. Eleanor stood as well, her legs unsteady. I need to see him. You need to do nothing of the sort, Adrian interrupted. Not without legal representation of your own. Mrs. Jennings, send word to my solicitor that his presence is required immediately, emergency rates be damned, and have someone take Thomas to the nursery. He shouldn't hear whatever is about to be said. I want to see Uncle Marcus, Thomas piped up from the table, his small face troubled. I want to tell him to leave Mama alone. Eleanor knelt beside his chair, cupping his face in her hands. Sweetheart, no. This is adult business. Please go with Mrs. Jennings and— He's my uncle, Thomas insisted, his lower lip trembling. Papa said family is important. Maybe if I talk to him, he'll understand that I want to stay with you. Thomas, listen to me, Eleanor began, but Adrian interrupted gently. The boy has a point, Eleanor. She whirled on him, fury blazing in her eyes. You cannot possibly think— I think that Marcus Hartley is trying to paint you as someone who's isolated Thomas from his family. If the boy appears comfortable and happy here, if he demonstrates that he's not being coerced or frightened, it weakens that narrative considerably. Adrian looked down at Thomas with surprising gentleness. But only if that's what Thomas genuinely wants. No one will force you to see your uncle, lad. This is your choice. Thomas squared his small shoulders with a determination that broke Eleanor's heart. I want to see him. I want to tell him that Mama is good and kind, and I don't want to live with him. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, fighting the urge to scoop Thomas up and run. But running had never solved anything. She'd learned that the hard way. All right, she whispered, but I'll be right there with you. And if I say we're leaving, we leave immediately. Understood? Thomas nodded solemnly. The walk to the library felt like a march to the gallows. Adrian led the way. Eleanor followed with Thomas's hand gripped tightly in hers, and Mrs. Jennings brought up the rear like a concerned nursemaid. The corridors of Blackthorne Manor seemed to stretch endlessly, each portrait on the walls staring down with judgment. When they entered the library, Marcus Hartley was standing at the window with his back to the door, examining a first-edition volume of Milton with the casual entitlement of a man accustomed to handling other people's treasures. He was tall and well-dressed, with the same dark hair as his late brother, but none of Jonathan's warmth. His eyes were cold calculation, and when he turned to face them, his smile didn't reach those eyes at all. Eleanor, he said, not bothering with proper address, how theatrical of you to emerge from the grave at a duke's Christmas ball. One might think you planned it for maximum effect. Mr. Hartley, Eleanor replied coolly, I don't recall inviting you to Blackthorne Manor. Oh, but I'm not here to see you, dear sister-in-law. I'm here to collect my nephew. Thomas, come here, boy. It's time to stop this nonsense and come home with your family. Thomas pressed closer to Eleanor's skirts, and she felt him trembling. But when he spoke, his voice was clear and firm. I am home. Mama is my family. Marcus's smile thinned to a razor's edge. That woman is not your mother, Thomas. She's a stranger who inserted herself into your father's life through deception and manipulation. Your real mother died giving you life. Don't dishonor her memory." "That's enough," Adrian said sharply, stepping forward. "You will not speak to the boy that way in my home." Marcus turned his cold gaze on Adrian, and Eleanor saw the calculation there, the weighing of advantages, the assessment of weaknesses. "Ah, yes, the Duke. How convenient that Eleanor has secured such powerful protection. One might wonder what services she's providing in exchange." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Adrian moved with the fluid grace of a predator, closing the distance between himself and Marcus until they stood almost nose to nose. When he spoke, his voice was deadly quiet. "You will apologize to Mrs. Hartley immediately, or you will leave my home through the nearest window, and I don't particularly care if it's on the ground floor." "Your Grace," the solicitor interjected nervously, a weaselly man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers, "my client meant no disrespect. He's simply concerned for his nephew's welfare." "Your client," Adrian said without taking his eyes off Marcus, "is a man so consumed by greed that he would traumatize a 5-year-old child to get his hands on a railway fortune. I've seen his type before. They dress up avarice as concern and call it family duty." Marcus's jaw clenched, but he took a step back. "You know nothing about my family situation, Your Grace. My brother was not in his right mind when he married this woman. He was dying, desperate, and she took advantage of that vulnerability. The courts will see it clearly." "The courts will see what the evidence shows them," Adrian countered, "and all the evidence points to a woman who has devoted herself to caring for a child who is not her own, a child who is clearly healthy, educated, and deeply attached to her." "Attachment can be manufactured," Marcus said dismissively. "Children are easily manipulated by those who know how to play on their emotions. My solicitor and I have been gathering testimony from Jonathan's servants, his business associates, people who witnessed this arrangement from the beginning. We have statements suggesting that Eleanor deliberately isolated my brother from his family in his final months, that she controlled who could visit, what information reached him, that she poisoned him against his own blood relatives." "That's a lie," Eleanor burst out. "Jonathan made his own decisions about who he wanted around him. He cut you off, Marcus, because you spent 5 years trying to convince him to send Thomas away to boarding school at age 3, because you cared more about his money than his son." "I cared about preserving the family legacy," Marcus shot back, "something you would know nothing about, given that you have no family at all. Tell me, Eleanor, or should I call you Miss Ashford, since that was your name before you conveniently died and reinvented yourself. What were you running from? What scandal were you escaping when you faked that train wreck disappearance?" Eleanor felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "I didn't fake anything. I was in that wreck. I have the scars to prove it." "Scars can come from anywhere," Marcus said smoothly. "What you don't have is any proof that you were actually on that train. No ticket was purchased in your name. No luggage was recovered. No witness placed you at the station or on board. You simply vanished and then reappeared 3 months later with no memory and a convenient new identity. It's remarkably suspicious, don't you think?" The solicitor cleared his throat. This was worse than she'd imagined. Marcus wasn't just attacking her fitness as a guardian. He was systematically destroying her entire existence, casting doubt on everything from her identity to her morals. And he was doing it in front of Thomas, who stood frozen at her side, his small hand gripping hers with painful intensity. "Thomas," she said quietly, "please go with Mrs. Jennings now. I need to speak with your uncle privately." "No," Thomas said, his voice shaking but determined. "No, Mama. I won't leave you." Marcus laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. "Look at that. The boy is so terrified of displeasing her that he won't even leave the room. That's not love, Thomas. That's fear. And when we go before the judge, that fear will be all the evidence we need." Something inside Eleanor snapped. She released Thomas's hand and stepped forward until she stood directly in front of Marcus Hartley, close enough to see the pores on his nose and smell the pomade in his hair. "You want a war, Marcus? Then let's have one. But understand this. You're not fighting for Thomas's well-being. You're fighting for money that you didn't earn and don't deserve. And I will burn every penny of that inheritance before I let you use it to destroy this child's life." Marcus's eyes widened slightly. "Are you threatening to defraud? I'm promising that I will sell every asset, divest every investment, and donate every shilling to charity before I hand it over to you," Eleanor said clearly. Jonathan's will gave me control of the estate until Thomas comes of age. If I'm declared unfit, that control passes to the court-appointed guardian, who will be you. But between now and February 5th, I can do whatever I want with that money. So go ahead, Marcus. Take me to court. Win your custody battle. And discover that you've bankrupted yourself with legal fees for the privilege of raising a penniless child. The color drained from Marcus's face. You wouldn't dare. I'd be happy to provide the names of several excellent solicitors who could draw up the paperwork quite quickly. Marcus's face turned an ugly shade of purple. This isn't over. The hearing is still scheduled for February 5th, and when we go before that judge, I will demonstrate exactly what kind of woman you are, Eleanor. I will drag every sordid detail of your past through the courtroom. I will prove that you're unfit, unstable, and unworthy of raising any child, let alone my nephew. Then I'll see you in court, Eleanor said quietly. Now get out. Marcus stormed from the library with his solicitor scrambling behind him like a nervous terrier. The sound of the front door slamming echoed through the manor like a gunshot. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Thomas burst into tears and threw himself at Eleanor, wrapping his thin arms around her waist and sobbing into her dress. I'm sorry, he gasped between tears. I'm sorry, Mama. I should have been braver. I should have told him. Shh, darling, no, Eleanor murmured, dropping to her knees and pulling him close. You were so brave, so incredibly brave. I'm proud of you. But he said terrible things about you. He said you were bad and that I shouldn't love you, and he was wrong, Thomas. He was wrong about everything. Eleanor pulled back just enough to look into her son's tear-stained face. Listen to me. People will say cruel things because they want something we have. But the truth is stronger than lies. And the truth is that I love you more than anything in this world. Do you believe me? Thomas nodded, hiccuping slightly. I believe you, Mama. Good. Now why don't you go with Mrs. Jennings and wash your face? I think there might be some of those chocolate biscuits left from last night, if someone hasn't eaten them all. Thomas managed a watery smile and allowed Mrs. Jennings to lead him away. The housekeeper gave Eleanor's shoulder a brief, supportive squeeze as she passed. Then Eleanor and Adrian were alone in the library, and the silence between them was deafening. That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen, Adrian said finally, or the most reckless, possibly both. Eleanor laughed shakily, still kneeling on the floor. I have no idea where that came from. I looked at him trying to use Thomas's inheritance as leverage, and something inside me broke. Or maybe it finally mended. I don't know. Adrian crossed to her and offered his hand. She took it, and he pulled her to her feet with easy strength. But he didn't immediately release her hand, and Eleanor found herself standing close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body. Did you mean it? Adrian asked quietly. About liquidating the estate? Every word, Eleanor said. I won't let Marcus use Jonathan's money to buy Thomas away from me. I'd rather we lived in a cottage and ate porridge for every meal than hand that child over to a man who sees him as nothing more than an obstacle. You realize you've just escalated this conflict to all-out war. I know. Marcus will be ruthless now. He'll dig up every piece of dirt he can find. He'll twist every rumor, exploit every weakness. He'll make the custody hearing into a public spectacle designed to humiliate you. I know, Eleanor repeated, but at least now we're fighting on honest terms. No more pretending this is about Thomas's welfare. It's about money and power and control. And in that kind of fight, I finally know where I stand. Adrian studied her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. Where do you stand, Eleanor? On the side of the people I love, she said simply. No matter what it costs me. Something shifted in Adrian's expression. Something raw and painful and achingly familiar. He raised his free hand as if to touch her face, then caught himself and stepped back, breaking the contact between them. My solicitor will be here within the hour, he said, his voice carefully neutral again. We'll begin preparing your defense immediately. And Eleanor, he paused at the library door. That threat you made about liquidating the assets, don't actually do it. Not yet. But keep Marcus believing you will. Fear is a powerful weapon, and right now, you've just reminded him that you're not helpless. After he left, Eleanor sank into one of the leather chairs by the fireplace. her entire body shaking with delayed reaction. She had just declared war on a man who would stop at nothing to destroy her. She had gambled everything on a bluff that might not hold. And she had done it all in front of the one person whose opinion still mattered to her after all these years. But as terrifying as it was, Eleanor also felt something she hadn't experienced in a very long time. She felt powerful. That feeling of power lasted exactly 3 days. On the morning of the 4th day after Marcus's visit, Eleanor woke to find Adrian's butler standing at her bedroom door with a silver tray bearing a single envelope. The man's face was carefully blank, but his hands trembled slightly as he held out the tray. This arrived by special courier, Mrs. Hartley. His Grace asked that I deliver it to you immediately. Eleanor took the envelope with fingers that already knew, somehow, that nothing good waited inside. The paper was expensive, cream-colored, sealed with red wax that bore the imprint of the Royal Courts of Justice. She broke the seal and read while standing in her nightgown, the cold morning air raising goosebumps on her arms. The hearing had been moved up, not to February 5th as originally scheduled, but to January 15th, less than 2 weeks away. Marcus had petitioned for an emergency custody order on grounds of immediate danger to the child. The petition cited Eleanor's unstable mental state, her threats to liquidate the estate, and new evidence that had supposedly come to light regarding her fraudulent identity. The letter slipped from Eleanor's nerveless fingers and drifted to the floor like a white leaf. 2 weeks. She had 2 weeks to prepare a defense that would stand against whatever weapons Marcus had assembled. 2 weeks to prove she was fit to raise a child when half of London society already believed she was either a fraud, a fortune hunter, or both. She dressed mechanically, her fingers fumbling with buttons and laces, then went to check on Thomas. He was still asleep, curled on his side with one hand tucked under his cheek, looking heartbreakingly small in the large bed. Eleanor stood watching him breathe for a long moment, memorizing the curve of his eyelashes, the soft rise and fall of his chest. Then she went to find Adrian. He was in his study, surrounded by papers and law books, looking like he hadn't slept. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, his hair was disheveled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of long hours and hard thinking. "You've seen it," he said without preamble when she entered. 2 weeks, Adrian. He's moved it to 2 weeks. "I know." Adrian's voice was grim. "My solicitor believes Marcus has found something, some piece of evidence he thinks will be decisive. That's the only reason to push for an emergency hearing. He wants to strike before we have time to counter whatever he's discovered." Eleanor sank into a chair across from his desk. What could he possibly have found? "I've told you everything about my life with Jonathan. There's nothing scandalous, nothing improper. I was a good wife and a devoted mother." "I believe you," Adrian said. "But Marcus doesn't need truth, Eleanor. He needs doubt. And he's very good at manufacturing it." He hesitated, then pushed a newspaper across the desk toward her. This appeared in yesterday's evening edition. Eleanor picked up the paper with a sense of dread. The headline made her stomach turn. "The Ghost of Blackthorne Manor. Duke Shelter's mysterious widow with questionable past." The article was vicious. It detailed her appearance at the Christmas ball, her claim of amnesia, her marriage to Jonathan Hartley. But it went further, dredging up old rumors about her relationship with Adrian 5 years ago, speculating about what might have driven a young woman to stage her own death, and questioning whether her amnesia was genuine or a convenient fiction designed to escape the consequences of scandal. "They're calling me a liar," Eleanor whispered. "They're saying I faked everything, the accident, the memory loss, even the marriage." "They're saying worse than that," Adrian said quietly. "Read the second page." She turned the page and felt the blood drain from her face. There, in black and white, was a letter supposedly written by one of Jonathan Hartley's former servants, a maid who had been dismissed 6 months before Jonathan's death. The letter claimed that Eleanor had isolated Jonathan from his family, that she had entertained male visitors while her husband was bedridden, that she had been seen burning documents in the fireplace the night before Jonathan died. Every word was a lie. Every single word. But printed in a newspaper, signed with a name and a statement of sworn testimony, the lies took on the weight of truth. "This is Marcus's work," Eleanor said, her voice shaking with fury. "He paid that woman to say these things. She was dismissed for stealing silver, not because I isolated Jonathan. And I would never. I know, Adrian said, but the damage is done. By tomorrow, every household in England will have read this. And when we go before that judge in 2 weeks, these accusations will be sitting in his mind like poison. Eleanor crumpled the newspaper in her fists. So what do we do? How do we fight this? We find our own evidence. We build a case so strong that even these lies can't topple it. Adrian stood and came around the desk, his expression intense. My solicitor has a plan. It's aggressive, possibly dangerous, but it might be our only chance. Tell me. We go to Yorkshire, to the village where you spent those 3 months after the accident. We find the doctor who treated you, the women who cared for you, anyone who can testify to your condition when you arrived. We gather medical records, witness statements, anything that proves your amnesia was real. Eleanor's breath caught. Yorkshire, where it all began. It's a risk, Adrian continued. The journey will take 3 days each way. We'll be traveling together, unchaperoned, which will only fuel the gossip, and there's no guarantee we'll find what we need. The doctor may have died or moved. The witnesses may have forgotten. But it's better than sitting here waiting for Marcus to destroy you piece by piece. What about Thomas? He stays here with Mrs. Jennings and a staff I trust with my life. Marcus can't remove him from Blackthorne Manor without a court order, and he doesn't have that yet. The boy will be safe. Eleanor stood and paced to the window, looking out over the frost-covered grounds. Everything in her screamed to stay close to Thomas, to not let him out of her sight. But Adrian was right. They needed evidence, and that evidence was in Yorkshire. When do we leave? She asked. Tomorrow morning, before Marcus learns what we're planning and finds a way to stop us. Adrian's hand came to rest on her shoulder, a brief warm pressure that sent electricity racing down her spine. Eleanor, I need you to understand what this means. If we do this, if we travel together to Yorkshire, the scandal will be enormous. People will assume the worst. Your reputation, such as it is, will be completely destroyed. Eleanor turned to face him and found him standing closer than she'd realized. Close enough that she could see the flecks of silver in his dark eyes, close enough to catch the faint scent of soap and coffee, and something uniquely him. My reputation has been destroyed since the moment I walked back from the dead, she said quietly. What's a little more scandal compared to losing Thomas? And us? Adrian asked, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. What about what this will do to us? Eleanor's heart hammered in her chest. There is no us, Adrian. There can't be. Not with everything that's happened, not with who I've become. You're wrong, he said simply. There's always been an us, Eleanor. Even when I thought you were dead, even when you were married to another man, even now, when every logical reason says we should stay apart. I loved you 5 years ago, and He stopped himself, stepping back, putting necessary distance between them. I'm sorry. That was inappropriate. You have enough to worry about without me complicating things further. Eleanor's throat was tight. Adrian, We should prepare for the journey, he interrupted, his voice brisk and businesslike again. Pack light, warm clothes. We'll be staying in coaching inns, so don't expect luxury. And Eleanor, bring any documents you have from your marriage to Jonathan. Letters, receipts, anything that shows the true nature of your relationship. He left the study before she could respond, and Eleanor stood alone in the quiet room, her heart aching with all the things she wanted to say but couldn't. She spent the rest of the day preparing. She explained to Thomas that she had to go away for a few days but would be back before he knew it. The boy cried and clung to her, and it took Mrs. Jennings and the promise of daily rides on the rocking horse to calm him down. That evening, Eleanor sat in her room sorting through the small trunk of belongings she'd brought from Yorkshire, all that remained of her life with Jonathan. There were letters, dozens of them, written in Jonathan's careful hand. She read through them now with fresh eyes, seeing the warmth and respect in his words, the gradual evolution from employer to friend to husband. One letter in particular caught her attention. It was dated 2 weeks before Jonathan's death, and unlike the others, it was addressed not to her but to whom it may concern. I, Jonathan Hartley, being of sound mind and body, do hereby state the following truths. My wife, Eleanor Hartley, has been the greatest blessing of my final years. She came to me as a stranger, lost and broken, and I watched her rebuild herself through sheer determination and grace. She married me not for wealth or position, but because I asked her to protect the son I loved more than my own life. If anyone questions her fitness to raise Thomas, let them know that I chose her deliberately, carefully, and without regret. She is the mother my son deserves, and I trust her completely with his future. If my brother Marcus contests this arrangement, it is only because he values money more than family. Do not let him take Thomas from the only mother the boy has ever known. The letter was signed, dated, and notarized. Eleanor stared at it with tears streaming down her face. Jonathan had known. He had known Marcus would fight, and he had left her this weapon. Why hadn't she remembered it sooner? She took the letter to Adrian immediately, finding him in the library with his solicitor, a sharp-eyed man named Mr. Pembroke, who had the efficient manner of someone accustomed to winning. "This changes everything," Pembroke said after reading the letter twice. "This is a deathbed declaration from the deceased, clearly stating his wishes and his assessment of both his wife and his brother. It's enormously powerful evidence." "Will it be enough?" Eleanor asked. Pembroke hesitated. "It's significant, but Mr. Hartley's lawyers will argue that Jonathan was mentally incompetent when he wrote it, unduly influenced by you, desperate and not thinking clearly. We still need the medical evidence from Yorkshire. We still need to prove your story about the amnesia is true." "Then we leave at dawn," Adrian said, "as planned." That night, Eleanor barely slept. She lay awake listening to the house settle around her, the creak of old wood and the whisper of winter wind. Somewhere down the hall, Adrian was probably also awake, preparing for a journey that would either save her or condemn her completely. She thought about what he'd said in his study. "I loved you 5 years ago." He hadn't finished the sentence, but she knew what words had been hovering on his tongue. "And I love you still." The truth was, she loved him too, had never stopped loving him, even when she'd married Jonathan, even when she'd convinced herself that Adrian belonged to a past she could never reclaim. But love wasn't enough. Not when her first duty was to Thomas, not when accepting Adrian's love would only give Marcus more ammunition. So she would go to Yorkshire with him. She would gather the evidence they needed. And then, when the hearing was over and Thomas was safe, she would find a way to leave Blackthorne Manor and put distance between herself and the man whose very presence made her heart ache. Dawn came cold and gray, with fog hanging low over the grounds. Eleanor kissed Thomas goodbye, holding him tight until Mrs. Jennings gently pried him away, and then she climbed into Adrian's carriage with a small trunk and a heart full of dread. They traveled in silence for the first hour, the carriage rocking through empty countryside while Eleanor stared out the window at nothing. Finally, Adrian spoke. "We should talk about what we'll say if anyone questions why we're traveling together." "We'll say you're helping me gather evidence for the custody hearing," Eleanor replied. "It's the truth." "A truth that will be twisted into scandal," Adrian pointed out. "We need a better story." "Then you tell me what story won't be twisted, Adrian, because in my experience, people believe what they want to believe. We could have a dozen chaperones and travel in separate carriages, and they'd still find a way to make it sordid." Adrian was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What if we made it true?" Eleanor's head snapped toward him. "What?" "What if we made their assumptions true? Eleanor, marry me." The world seemed to tilt sideways. "You can't be serious," Eleanor breathed. "I'm completely serious." Adrian leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Think about it. If we marry before the hearing, Marcus loses his strongest weapon. He can't claim you're an unfit single mother with questionable morals if you're the Duchess of Blackthorne. He can't argue that Thomas needs a proper family when he'll have a duke for a stepfather. And he certainly can't suggest that you're after money when you'll have access to one of the largest fortunes in England." "That's insane," Eleanor said flatly. "Adrian, you can't throw away your life to solve my legal problems. Marriage it's forever. It's not a legal strategy." "It's both," Adrian countered. "And I'm not throwing away my life. I'm claiming the one I should have had 5 years ago if that damn train hadn't crashed. We can't. People will say. People are already saying every terrible thing they can imagine. Let's give them something true to talk about instead of lies." He reached across the carriage and took her hands in his. "Eleanor, I'm not asking you to love me. I know you cared for Jonathan. I know you're grieving. I'm asking you to let me help you in the most effective way possible. We marry quietly, before witnesses, and present ourselves to the court as a united front. Marcus will have no grounds to challenge you." Eleanor pulled her hands free, her mind reeling. "You're asking me to marry you for convenience, for strategy." "I'm asking you to marry me because I never stopped loving you," Adrian said quietly. "But if you need to believe it's just strategy, I can live with that. For now." The carriage hit a rut in the road, jolting them both, and Eleanor used the moment to put more distance between them. Her heart was racing, her thoughts a chaotic tangle. Marriage to Adrian. It was everything she'd once dreamed of and everything she'd learned to live without. It was salvation and damnation wrapped together. It would save Thomas, she had no doubt of that. But it would also bind her to a man she loved too much and didn't deserve. "I need time to think," she whispered. "We don't have time," Adrian said. "The hearing is in 11 days. If we're going to do this, we need to do it now in Yorkshire before we return to London." "You've already planned this," Eleanor realized. "This whole journey, you've been planning this from the beginning." "I've been planning how to keep you safe from the moment you walked back into my life," Adrian admitted. "Whether that's through evidence or marriage or both, I'll use every weapon I have, Eleanor, because losing you once nearly destroyed me. I won't lose you again." Eleanor closed her eyes against the tears that threatened to fall. "What about what I want, Adrian? What about my choice?" "I'm giving you a choice," he said. "Marry me and fight Marcus with every advantage we can muster. Or don't, and we'll fight with what we have and hope it's enough. Either way, I'm not abandoning you. But one path gives Thomas a much better chance at a future with you in it." The rest of the journey passed in tense silence. They stopped at a coaching inn for the night, taking separate rooms under the watchful eyes of a landlady who clearly had opinions about a gentleman and lady traveling together. Eleanor lay awake in a narrow bed, listening to the sounds of the inn, footsteps, voices, the rattle of wagons outside, and tried to think clearly. Marriage to Adrian would solve the immediate problem, but it would create new ones. How could she be his wife knowing that he deserved better than a woman with a shadowed past and another man's child? How could she live with the knowledge that he'd sacrificed his future for her sake? And yet, the alternative was risking Thomas. Was that a risk she had the right to take? By the time dawn broke over the Yorkshire moors, Eleanor had made her decision. They reached the village of Ashcroft on the afternoon of the third day. It was a small place, barely more than a collection of stone cottages clustered around a church and a mill pond. Eleanor recognized it immediately, though her memories of those early months here were still fragmented and hazy. "The doctor's house is there," she said, pointing to a cottage set slightly apart from the others. "Dr. Graham. He was the one who treated me." They knocked on the door, but it was opened not by Dr. Graham, but by a young man who introduced himself as Dr. Peter Graham, son of the late Dr. William Graham. "My father passed 2 years ago," the younger Graham explained, showing them into a cluttered study. "But I have his records, if that's what you're seeking." He was meticulous about documentation. Relief flooded through Eleanor. "I need records of my treatment here in 1843. I was brought to your father after the Manchester train wreck. I had severe head trauma and amnesia." Dr. Graham pulled out several leather-bound journals and began searching. After several minutes, he looked up with recognition dawning on his face. "Miss Ashford, or rather, Mrs. Hartley now, I see from the papers." "Yes, I remember you. I was just a medical student then, helping my father. You were in terrible condition when they brought you in. Concussion, broken ribs, lacerations, and the memory loss was profound. You didn't even know your own name for weeks." "Can you testify to that?" Adrian asked. "In court? Under oath?" Dr. Graham nodded slowly. "I can, and I can provide my father's medical notes, which detail the extent of your injuries and the progression of your recovery. Is this for the custody matter? I've seen the papers, terrible business using a child as a pawn in a property dispute." "Thank you," Eleanor said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you so much." They spent the next 2 days gathering statements from everyone who had helped Eleanor during those lost months. The rector's wife who had given her clothes, the farmer who had found her in his field, delirious and bloodied, the women who had sat with her during the worst of the recovery. Each statement was a piece of armor, a shield against Marcus's lies. On their final evening in Yorkshire, Adrian found Eleanor standing outside the church where she'd spent many hours during her recovery, staring up at the stars. "We have what we need," he said quietly. "Enough evidence to prove your amnesia was real. Enough witnesses to establish your character. We can go back to London and fight Marcus with confidence." "Or we could do what you suggested," Eleanor said, not looking at him. "We could marry tomorrow. The rector here would perform the ceremony. 2 witnesses from the village would be enough." Adrian's breath caught. "Are you saying yes?" Eleanor finally turned to face him, and in the moonlight her eyes were luminous with unshed tears. "I'm saying that I won't risk Thomas for the sake of my pride. If marrying you gives him the best chance at staying with me, then that's what I'll do. But, Adrian," she stepped closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "I need you to understand something. I can't be the woman I was 5 years ago. That girl died in the train wreck. What came back was someone different, someone harder, someone who's made compromises and lived through things that changed her. If you marry me, you're not getting the Eleanor you loved. You're getting whoever I've become." Adrian reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his touch infinitely gentle. "I don't want the girl from 5 years ago, Eleanor. I want the woman standing in front of me, the woman who threatened to burn an entire fortune to protect a child, the woman who walked into a ballroom full of enemies with her head held high, the woman who survived." "I don't love you the way I should," Eleanor whispered, even as she leaned into his touch. "Not the way a wife should love a husband. I'm too broken for that." "Then we'll start from broken," Adrian said simply, "and we'll build something new from the pieces." Eleanor closed her eyes, feeling tears slip down her cheeks. "Tomorrow, then. We'll marry tomorrow." "Tomorrow," Adrian agreed. But as Eleanor lay in bed that night, unable to sleep, a sick feeling of dread settled in her stomach. Something was wrong. Some instinct honed by years of hardship was screaming at her that this was too easy, that Marcus wouldn't have pushed for an emergency hearing unless he had something devastating in reserve. She wouldn't know until much later how right that instinct was. They married the next morning in Ashcroft's small stone church, with Dr. Graham and the rector's wife as witnesses. Eleanor wore a simple gray dress, and Adrian had no ring to give her, so they used a silver band borrowed from the rector's wife. The ceremony was brief and perfunctory, the words ancient and binding. When the rector pronounced them husband and wife, Adrian kissed her gently, a kiss that tasted of promises and regret and hope all tangled together. "We should return to London," Adrian said as they signed the marriage registry. "We have the evidence we need, and the hearing is in 4 days. There's work to be done." They traveled back faster than they'd come, pushing through with minimal stops. Eleanor watched the countryside blur past and tried to process the fact that she was now the Duchess of Blackthorne, that she had married Adrian in a village church with no celebration, no joy, only grim determination to protect a child. It felt wrong. It felt necessary. It felt like both salvation and betrayal. They reached Blackthorne Manor late on the evening of January 12th, 3 days before the hearing. Mrs. Jennings met them at the door, her face pale and frightened. "Your Grace," she said to Adrian, then caught herself. "Your Graces. Thank heaven you're back. There's trouble." Eleanor's heart stopped. "Thomas? Where's Thomas?" "He's safe, Your Grace, sleeping upstairs, but there are constables waiting in the drawing room. They arrived this morning with a warrant." "A warrant for what?" Adrian demanded. Mrs. Jennings wrung her hands. "For Mrs. Hartley's arrest, or rather, the Duchess's arrest now. They're saying, oh, it's terrible, they're saying she murdered her husband." The floor dropped out from under Eleanor's feet. "That's impossible," Adrian said sharply. "Jonathan Hartley died of heart failure. There were doctors in attendance. A death certificate was issued." "I know, Your Grace, but they're saying new evidence has come to light, that someone has testified Mrs. Hartley poisoned him. They have a witness, they say, and the magistrate has issued a warrant for her arrest on suspicion of murder." Eleanor stood frozen in the entrance hall of Blackthorne Manor, snowmelt pooling around her boots, and understood with terrible clarity what Marcus had done. He hadn't just attacked her fitness as a guardian, he had turned her into a killer. And in 4 days, she would stand before a judge, not just to fight for Thomas's custody, but to fight for her own freedom. The constables were young men, clearly uncomfortable with their assignment. They stood in Adrian's drawing room, shifting their weight from foot to foot, holding their warrants like shields against the fury radiating from the Duke of Blackthorne. "You will explain," Adrian said in a voice like cut glass, "exactly who has accused my wife of murder and on what grounds." The older of the two constables, barely 30, with a nervous twitch in his left eye, cleared his throat. "Your Grace, we're only following orders from Magistrate Blackwell. A witness has come forward with testimony that Mrs., that is, her Grace, administered poison to her late husband, Jonathan Hartley, in the weeks before his death." "What witness?" Eleanor demanded. She stood with her spine straight as an iron rod, refusing to show the terror clawing at her insides. "Name them." The constable consulted his papers. "A Miss Sarah Wickham, formerly employed as a maid in the Hartley household. She's given a sworn statement that she observed your Grace mixing substances into Mr. Hartley's evening tea on multiple occasions. She states that Mr. Hartley's health deteriorated rapidly after these incidents, and that he complained of stomach pains and weakness." "Sarah Wickham is the maid I mentioned in the newspaper article," Eleanor said, her voice shaking with rage. "The one Marcus paid to lie about me. She was dismissed for theft 6 months before Jonathan died. She wasn't even in the household when he passed." "Be that as it may, Your Grace, the magistrate has found her testimony credible enough to issue a warrant. You're to come with us for questioning." "She's not going anywhere," Adrian said flatly. The constable's face flushed. "Your Grace, with all respect, this is a matter of law. We have our orders. If you interfere with an arrest, you'll be held in contempt." "Then hold me in contempt," Adrian shot back. "But you're not taking her anywhere tonight. My wife has just completed a 3-day journey. She's exhausted. And I'll be damned if I let you haul her off to some cell based on the lies of a woman who was caught stealing silver candlesticks." Eleanor put a hand on Adrian's arm. "It's all right. I'll go. I have nothing to hide." "Eleanor, no. If I refuse, it only makes me look guilty," Eleanor said quietly. "Better to face this head on. Answer their questions. Demonstrate that their witness is lying." Adrian's jaw clenched so hard Eleanor could hear his teeth grind. "Fine, but I'm coming with you, and so is Mr. Pembroke. You don't say a word without legal counsel present." The magistrate's office was a cramped room that smelled of old paper and damp wool. Magistrate Blackwell was a round man with shrewd eyes and fingers stained with ink. He looked up when Eleanor entered, flanked by Adrian and Pembroke, and his expression suggested he'd been expecting someone far less composed. "Your Grace," he said, nodding to Eleanor with what might have been respect or might have been mockery. "Please sit. This is merely a preliminary inquiry. I need to ask you some questions about your late husband's final illness." Eleanor sat with her hands folded in her lap, every inch the Duchess despite her travel-stained dress and exhaustion-bruised eyes. "I'm happy to answer any questions, Magistrate Blackwell. My husband died of heart failure. His physician, Dr. Reynolds, can confirm that Jonathan had been suffering from a weak heart for years." "Indeed, Dr. Reynolds has provided that information," Blackwell said, shuffling through papers. "However, Miss Wickham's testimony suggests that his symptoms worsened considerably in his final weeks. She claims to have seen you preparing herbal tinctures and adding them to his tea." "I did prepare herbal tinctures," Eleanor said calmly, "with Dr. Reynolds' approval and under his direction. Jonathan suffered from insomnia and anxiety as his condition worsened. The doctor recommended chamomile, valerian root, and lavender to help him rest. I prepared these remedies myself because I wanted to ensure they were made properly." Blackwell's eyebrows rose. "You have knowledge of medicinal herbs?" "I learned during my time recovering in Yorkshire after the train accident. The doctor's wife was an herbalist. She taught me basic remedies." Eleanor leaned forward slightly. "Magistrate, I loved my husband. Not with passion, perhaps, but with deep respect and affection. He gave me a home and a purpose when I had nothing. The idea that I would poison him is not only false, it's absurd. What possible motive would I have?" "His fortune," Blackwell said bluntly, "and control of his son's inheritance." "I already had both those things through our legal marriage," Eleanor countered. "Jonathan's will gave me guardianship of Thomas and control of the estate until the boy comes of age. I gained nothing from his death except grief and the burden of fighting off his grasping relatives. If I were truly a fortune hunter,
I would have wanted Jonathan alive as long as possible. Blackwell sat back, studying her. Miss Wickham seems quite certain about what she saw. Miss Wickham, Pembroke interjected smoothly, was dismissed from the Hartley household in March of last year for theft. Mr. Hartley died in September. She was not present during his final illness and could not possibly have witnessed the events she describes. Furthermore, we have evidence that she was recently paid a substantial sum by Mr. Marcus Hartley, the very man who stands to gain if her grace is removed as guardian. "Do you have proof of this payment?" Blackwell asked sharply. Pembroke produced a ledger. Bank records showing a transfer of £50 to Miss Wickham's account, made by Marcus Hartley 3 days before she gave her statement. "Rather convenient timing, wouldn't you say?" The magistrate's expression shifted. "Where did you obtain these records?" "Through entirely legal means," Pembroke said blandly. "Mr. Hartley has been less than careful about covering his tracks. We also have statements from several of Jonathan Hartley's actual servants, those who were present during his final illness, all of whom testify that her grace was a devoted wife who nursed him tirelessly. Dr. Reynolds himself will state that the herbal remedies she prepared were not only harmless, but helpful." Blackwell was silent for a long moment, his fingers drumming on the desk. Finally, he sighed. "I'll need to speak with Dr. Reynolds and review these bank records. Your Grace, you're free to return to Blackthorne Manor for now, but you must remain available for further questioning. The custody hearing is still scheduled for January 15th. This matter will likely be addressed then as well." "Wait," Eleanor said. "You're just going to leave this accusation hanging over me?" "Magistrate, I have a right to face my accuser. I want Sarah Wickham brought before the court. I want her to look me in the eye and repeat her lies under oath." Blackwell's mouth twitched. "That can be arranged. In fact, given the custody hearing is in 3 days, it seems prudent to address all these matters together. I'll inform Marcus Hartley's legal team that both the custody question and the murder accusation will be heard jointly." "That's highly irregular," Pembroke protested. "So is accusing a duchess of murder," Blackwell said dryly. "Your Grace, you're dismissed. I suggest you use the next 3 days to prepare a very thorough defense." They returned to Blackthorne Manor near midnight. Eleanor went immediately to check on Thomas, finding him asleep and peaceful, unaware that his mother had just been accused of murder. She stood watching him breathe, her hands trembling with delayed reaction. "He's safe," Mrs. Jennings whispered from the doorway. "I've had 2 footmen standing guard outside his room since the constables arrived. No one will take him, Your Grace, not while we draw breath." Eleanor turned to find genuine loyalty blazing in the older woman's eyes. "You believe me, that I didn't kill Jonathan?" "I know you didn't, Your Grace. I've seen the way you love that boy. No woman who loves a child that fiercely could harm his father. And begging your pardon, but anyone with eyes can see that Mr. Marcus Hartley is a weasel who'd sell his own soul for a railway stock certificate." Despite everything, Eleanor found herself smiling. "Thank you, Mrs. Jennings, for everything." She found Adrian in his study, pacing like a caged wolf. The moment she entered, he pulled her into his arms so fiercely she could barely breathe. "I should never have let them question you," he said into her hair. "I should have thrown them out, locked the doors, let them arrest me instead." "That wouldn't have helped anything," Eleanor said, her voice muffled against his chest. "Adrian, we need to be strategic. Marcus is getting desperate. This murder accusation, it's his last weapon. If we can dismantle it in court, we dismantle everything." Adrian pulled back just enough to look at her face. "You're remarkably calm for a woman who was just accused of killing her husband." "I'm not calm, I'm furious. And fury is far more useful than fear right now." Eleanor stepped out of his arms and began pacing. "Sarah Wickham is the key. If we can prove she's lying, really prove it, beyond any doubt, then everything Marcus has built collapses. The murder charge disappears, his credibility is destroyed. The judge will have no choice but to rule in my favor." "Pembroke is already working on it," Adrian assured her. "He's tracking down every servant who worked in the Hartley household, building a timeline of exactly when Wickham was dismissed versus when Jonathan died, gathering testimony about her character." "It won't be enough," Eleanor said. "We need more than character witnesses. We need proof that what she's describing is impossible. We need—" She stopped mid-pace, her eyes going wide. "Adrian,
Who prepared Jonathan's meals in those final weeks? You said you did, didn't you? You were nursing him. I prepared his herbal teas and tonics, but his actual meals were prepared by the cook, a woman named Mrs. Bradford, who had been with the Hartley family for 30 years. If I was poisoning Jonathan's tea, as Wickham claims, Mrs. Bradford would have seen it. She was in the kitchen every time I prepared those remedies. Adrian's expression sharpened.
Where is Mrs. Bradford now? Still at the Hartley estate, as far as I know. She stayed on when Marcus took over the household. Eleanor's mind was racing. We need to get to her before Marcus does. If he realizes she's a witness who can exonerate me, he'll either pay her off or intimidate her into silence. It's past midnight, Adrian pointed out. The Hartley estate is a 3-hour ride from here. Then we leave before dawn, Eleanor said. We get to Mrs. Bradford, we get her statement, and we bring her to court with us. Adrian, this is it.
This is how we win. They left Blackthorne Manor at 4 in the morning, while the stars were still sharp in the winter sky. This time they traveled fast and light, with Adrian driving the curricle himself rather than taking a full carriage. The cold air bit at Eleanor's face, but she welcomed it, welcomed anything that kept her alert and focused. They reached the Hartley estate as the sun was rising, painting the stone manor house in shades of gold and amber. It was smaller than Blackthorne, more modest, but it had been Eleanor's home for 3 years, and seeing it again made her chest ache. A sleepy footman answered their knock, his eyes going wide when he recognized Eleanor. Your Grace, we didn't know, that is, Mr. Marcus didn't say you'd be visiting. We're here to speak with Mrs. Bradford, Eleanor said firmly. It's urgent. The footman looked nervous. Mrs. Bradford is in the kitchen, but Mr. Marcus gave orders that you weren't to be admitted to the house, Your Grace. He said, I don't care what Marcus said, Adrian interrupted in a voice that could have frozen fire. This is still legally Mrs. Hartley's property. She has every right to enter. Now step aside or I'll move you aside. The footman stepped aside. They found Mrs. Bradford in the kitchen, exactly where Eleanor had known she'd be, preparing the household's breakfast. She was a stout woman in her 60s with flour-dusted hands and sharp eyes that missed nothing. When Eleanor entered, those eyes filled with tears. Your Grace, oh, thank heavens. I heard what they're saying about you, and it's lies, all lies. I tried to send word to you, but Mr. Marcus has been watching everyone like a hawk. Eleanor crossed the kitchen and took the older woman's hands. Mrs. Bradford, I need you to tell me exactly what you told Marcus's people when they questioned you about Jonathan's death. Mrs. Bradford's jaw set stubbornly. I told them the truth, that Mr. Jonathan died of a weak heart, just as Dr. Reynolds said, that you nursed him day and night with nothing but devotion, and that Miss Wickham is a lying thief who wasn't even in this house when the master died. And what did they say to that? They said my testimony wouldn't be needed, that they had all the evidence they required. Mrs. Bradford's voice hardened. But I'm not stupid, Your Grace. I know what they're doing. They're trying to paint you as a murderer so Mr. Marcus can take young Thomas, and I won't have it. That boy belongs with you, and anyone with eyes can see it. Mrs. Bradford, Adrian said gently, would you be willing to testify to that in court, under oath, before a judge? The cook drew herself up to her full height. Your Grace, I'd testify before the king himself if it would help Mrs. Eleanor. When do you need me? The hearing is January 15th, 2 days from now. Can you come to London? I'll pack my bags this instant, Mrs. Bradford said firmly, and I'll bring the household ledgers too, the ones that show exactly when Miss Wickham was dismissed and how much silver she stole. Mr. Marcus hasn't thought to hide those yet. They left the estate an hour later with Mrs. Bradford installed in the curricle and a trunk full of documents that would prove devastating to Marcus's case. Eleanor felt hope rising in her chest for the first time in days. But as they drove back toward London, a rider approached from the opposite direction, one of Adrian's footmen, his horse lathered with sweat. Your Grace, the man called out, pulling up short. I've been searching for you. You need to return to Blackthorne immediately. It's the boy, Thomas. He's gone missing. Eleanor's world stopped. Missing? Adrian's voice was sharp as a knife. What do you mean, missing? I left explicit orders that he was to be guarded. We were guarding him, Your Grace, But this morning, when Mrs. Jennings went to wake him, his bed was empty. We've searched the entire manor and the grounds. He's nowhere to be found, and there's a note." The footman handed over a crumpled piece of paper. Eleanor snatched it with shaking hands. The message was written in Marcus's distinctive scrawl. "If you want to see the boy again, you'll withdraw from the custody hearing and sign over all guardianship rights. Come to the hearing on January 15th prepared to concede, or Thomas will disappear somewhere you'll never find him. Choose wisely." The paper fell from Eleanor's nerveless fingers. "He took him," she whispered. "Teachin. Marcus took Thomas." Adrian's face had gone white as death. When? When did this happen?" "Sometime between midnight and dawn," the footman said. "The guards on his door were found unconscious, drugged, the doctor thinks. Someone slipped something into their evening meal." Eleanor felt the world tilting. All the evidence they'd gathered, all the witnesses they'd found, all the careful strategy. None of it mattered if Marcus had Thomas. He could make demands. He could threaten. He could hurt her son in ways that no court could prevent. "We have to find him," she said, her voice breaking. "Adrian, we have to—" "We will," Adrian said, his voice like iron. "Mrs. Bradford, I'm sending you back to London with my footman. You'll stay at Blackthorne Manor until the hearing. Eleanor and I are going to get Thomas back." "How?" Eleanor demanded. "We don't even know where Marcus is holding him. He could be anywhere. He could have taken him out of England, for all we know." He couldn't have gotten far," Adrian said, his mind clearly racing. "This happened less than 6 hours ago. With a 5-year-old child, he can't travel fast or inconspicuously. And Marcus is arrogant. He'll want to stay close to London so he can appear at the hearing and watch you surrender." "Then where?" Eleanor's voice was rising toward panic. "Adrian, where would he take him?" Adrian was quiet for a moment, thinking hard. Then his eyes narrowed. "The railway." Marcus was Jonathan's partner in several railway ventures. He has access to private cars, switching yards, maintenance buildings all along the London and Northwestern line. That's where I'd hide someone if I wanted them close but untraceable. "That's dozens of possible locations," Eleanor said desperately. "Not if we think like Marcus," Adrian countered. "He's not just hiding Thomas. He's using him as leverage for the hearing. He needs to be able to produce the boy quickly if you agree to his terms. That means somewhere within an hour of London, somewhere he controls completely." Eleanor's mind was working frantically. "The Camden switching yards. Jonathan took me there once. It's where they store damaged cars and equipment awaiting repair. Marcus has an office there. He'd have complete access, and it's isolated enough that no one would question seeing a man with a child." "That's 20 miles from here," Adrian said. "We can be there in under 2 hours if we push the horses." He turned to the footman. "Ride back to Blackthorne. Tell Pembroke what's happened and have him prepare the case to proceed without us if necessary. And send word to Magistrate Blackwell that Marcus Hartley has kidnapped a child. I want constables ready to arrest him the moment we have proof." They drove like demons toward Camden, the horses straining against the traces. Eleanor sat rigid in her seat, her hands clenched so tightly her nails drew blood from her palms. Thomas. Her sweet, brave Thomas, who trusted too easily and loved too deeply. If Marcus had frightened him, if he'd hurt him. She couldn't finish the thought. The Camden switching yards were a maze of rusting tracks and abandoned railway cars stretching across acres of muddy ground. Smoke rose from a few buildings where workers maintained equipment, but most of the facility was silent and empty in the cold January morning. Adrian pulled up at the main gate and jumped down. "Wait here. I'll find out where Marcus's office is." "I'm coming with you," Eleanor said, already climbing down. "Eleanor, if Marcus is there, I want to look him in the eye when I tear his heart out," Eleanor said with cold fury. "Thomas is my son. I'm not waiting anywhere." They found Marcus's office in a building near the center of the yards, a cramped room with a desk covered in papers and a stove that was still warm. But it was empty. Eleanor's heart sank. "He's not here. We guessed wrong." Then she heard it. A sound so faint she almost missed it. A child's voice calling out. Not screaming, not crying, but calling steadily, persistently. "Mama! Mama! I'm here! Thomas!" Eleanor ran from the office, following the sound. It was coming from one of the railway cars, an old passenger car with boarded-up windows sitting on a sidetrack. She wrenched open the door and saw him,
Thomas, sitting in the corner of the empty car, his face streaked with tears but his voice strong and determined. He'd been calling for her, she realized. Calling and calling, trusting that she would come. "Mama!" He launched himself at her, and Eleanor caught him, holding him so tightly she could feel his heart beat against hers. "I've got you," she whispered fiercely. "I've got you, darling. You're safe now." "Uncle Marcus said you wouldn't come," Thomas said into her shoulder. "He said you'd choose the money over me. But I knew he was lying. I knew you'd find me." "Where is he?" Adrian demanded, scanning the empty car. "Where's Marcus?" "He left," Thomas said, "hours ago. He locked me in here and said someone would come to take me far away if you didn't do what he wanted. But the lock was old and I managed to break it." He held up his small hands, showing scraped and bloodied knuckles. "I was trying to get out when I heard you." Eleanor examined his hands with a mother's horror. "You broke the lock yourself?" "You always said I was strong," Thomas said simply. "And you taught me to fight when I'm scared instead of hiding, so I fought." Adrian knelt beside them, his face a mixture of pride and fury. "You're the bravest boy I've ever met, Thomas. Your mother should be very proud of you." "She is," Eleanor whispered, tears streaming down her face. "She's so proud she can barely breathe." They brought Thomas back to Blackthorne Manor and sent immediately for a doctor to check him over. Apart from the scrapes on his hands and some bruising on his wrists from the ropes Marcus had used, he was unharmed. But Eleanor couldn't stop shaking, couldn't stop thinking about what might have happened if they'd guessed wrong, if they'd gone to the wrong place, if Thomas hadn't been clever enough to break that lock. "We have him," Adrian said quietly, finding her standing in the nursery long after Thomas had fallen asleep. "He's safe. Marcus failed." "This time?" Eleanor said. "But Adrian, he kidnapped a child. He drugged your servants and stole Thomas from his own bed. And he'll do it again if we don't stop him completely." "Then we'll stop him," Adrian said. "Tomorrow in court, we'll present every piece of evidence we have. We'll bring Mrs. Bradford. We'll show the judge those bank records proving he paid Wickham to lie. We'll present the medical evidence from Yorkshire. And we'll tell the judge that Marcus Hartley kidnapped a 5-year-old boy to blackmail his way into an inheritance. Eleanor, by the time we're finished, Marcus won't just lose the custody case. He'll be facing criminal charges." Eleanor turned to face him, and in her eyes was a determination that burned like cold fire. "I want more than that. I want him to lose everything. I want the entire world to see him for what he is. I want his name so destroyed that he'll never be able to hurt another child again." "Then that's what we'll do," Adrian promised, "together." The morning of January 15th dawned clear and cold. Eleanor dressed with meticulous care, choosing a deep blue gown that was neither widow's weeds nor frivolous, the dress of a woman who had nothing to hide and nothing to fear. She braided her hair in a crown around her head, the style making her look older, more regal. The Duchess of Blackthorne, not the frightened widow Marcus wanted her to be. Thomas insisted on coming to the courthouse, and after a long argument, Eleanor relented. "If the judge allows it, you can speak," she told him. "But Thomas, you have to understand. Uncle Marcus will say terrible things about me, about your father. You might hear things that upset you." "I know what Uncle Marcus is," Thomas said with a child's devastating honesty. "He's a bad man who wants money. Papa told me before he died. He said some people love things more than people, and that made them dangerous. I'm not afraid of him, Mama. Not anymore." The courtroom was packed. Every seat was filled with curious onlookers who had come to witness what the newspapers were calling the trial of the decade. Eleanor walked in with her hand on Adrian's arm, and Thomas holding her other hand, and she felt the weight of hundreds of eyes. Marcus sat at the defendant's table with his solicitor, and when he saw Thomas, his face went purple with rage. But he couldn't say anything, not here, not with the judge already taking his seat. Judge Aldrich was a severe man in his 60s, known for his sharp mind and no tolerance for theatrics. He banged his gavel once, and the courtroom fell silent. "This is a custody hearing regarding Thomas Jonathan Hartley, age 5, he began. "However, I understand there are also serious accusations of fraud, murder, and kidnapping that have been made by both parties. We will address all matters today and reach a final resolution. Mr. Hartley, you filed the original petition. You may present your case first."
Marcus's solicitor stood and launched into a practiced speech about Eleanor's questionable character, her mysterious past, her sudden marriage to a dying man. But it sounded hollow now, rehearsed, especially when he tried to present Sarah Wickham's testimony about the supposed poisoning. "Your Honor," Pembroke interrupted smoothly, "before we hear from Miss Wickham, I'd like to present evidence regarding her credibility." He laid out the bank records showing Marcus's payment. He presented the household ledgers proving Wickham had been dismissed months before Jonathan's death. And then he called Mrs. Bradford to the stand. The cook was magnificent. She spoke with the blunt honesty of someone who had spent 40 years feeding people and knew truth from lies. Miss Wickham couldn't have seen Mrs. Eleanor preparing remedies in those final weeks because Miss Wickham wasn't there, she said firmly. She was dismissed in March for stealing. Mr. Jonathan died in September, and I was in that kitchen every single day, watching Mrs. Eleanor care for her husband with nothing but devotion. Those herbal teas? Dr. Reynolds prescribed them. I saw the written instructions. If that man's lawyers are claiming otherwise, they're either fools or liars. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Aldrich banged his gavel for silence. "Call Miss Wickham," he ordered. But Sarah Wickham was nowhere to be found. According to the bailiff, she had fled London 2 days earlier after learning that her bank records had been subpoenaed. Marcus's solicitor tried to recover, shifting to attack Eleanor's fitness based on her amnesia and mysterious past. That's when Pembroke presented the medical records from Yorkshire, the statements from Dr. Graham and the villagers, the irrefutable proof that Eleanor had been genuinely injured in the train wreck and had genuinely lost her memory. "Furthermore," Pembroke continued, "I'd like to address the kidnapping that occurred 2 days ago." He presented the note Marcus had left. He called the footman who had been drugged. And then, in the moment that made the entire courtroom gasp, he called Thomas himself to the stand. The boy climbed into the witness box with his scraped hands visible to everyone, and the judge leaned forward with interest. "Son," Aldrich said gently, "can you tell me what happened 2 nights ago?" Thomas took a deep breath. "Uncle Marcus came into my room. He had something that smelled funny, a cloth. He put it over my mouth and I went to sleep. When I woke up, I was in a railway car and he said Mama had to give up being my mother or I'd never see her again." "And what did you do?" "I broke the lock and tried to escape," Thomas said simply. "Because Mama taught me to fight when I'm scared, and she always comes for me. Always." Judge Aldrich sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Hartley, did you abduct this child?" Marcus shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this is preposterous. The boy is obviously coached. His mother has been manipulating him from the beginning. Answer the question," Aldrich said coldly. "Did you or did you not remove Thomas Hartley from the Duke of Blackthorne's residence without permission?" "I was protecting my nephew from a woman who murdered his father," Marcus shouted. "I had every right." "You had no right," Aldrich interrupted. "None whatsoever. Constable, place Mr. Marcus Hartley under arrest for kidnapping and extortion." The courtroom exploded into chaos as constables moved forward to take Marcus into custody. He fought against them, still shouting accusations, but his words were drowned out by the shocked voices of the spectators. Judge Aldrich banged his gavel repeatedly until order was restored. Then he looked directly at Eleanor. "Your Grace," he said, and the use of her title was not lost on anyone. "I've heard enough. The accusations against you are transparently false, manufactured by a man desperate to steal an inheritance. The evidence of your devotion to this child is overwhelming. And furthermore, your recent marriage to the Duke of Blackthorne provides Thomas with exactly the kind of stable, respectable family environment the law seeks in custody cases." He turned to Thomas. "Young man, do you understand what's happening here today?" "Yes, sir," Thomas said clearly. "You're deciding if I can stay with my mama. And is that what you want? To stay with her?" "More than anything," Thomas said. "She's my mama. She's always been my mama. I don't care about money or houses or anything else. I just want her." Judge Aldrich's stern expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Then that's what you'll have. I hereby grant full and permanent custody of Thomas Jonathan Hartley to Eleanor Blackthorne, Duchess of Blackthorne. Furthermore, I'm ordering a full investigation into Marcus Hartley's financial dealings and appointing a court trustee to manage the Hartley estate until Thomas comes of age. This hearing is concluded." The gavel came down with a sound like thunder. For a moment, Eleanor couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't quite believe it was over. Then Thomas launched himself from the witness box into her arms, and she caught him, laughing and crying at the same time. Adrian was there too, wrapping both of them in his embrace, and Eleanor felt something inside her, something that had been locked tight for 5 years, finally crack open. They had won. Against all odds, against all the lies and accusations and weapons Marcus had thrown at them, they had won. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered, and as Eleanor emerged with Thomas in her arms and Adrian at her side, something unexpected happened. People began to applaud. Not everyone. There were still plenty of hostile faces, still whispers and judgment, but enough that Eleanor could hear it over the pounding of her own heart. They weren't cheering for scandal or drama. They were cheering for a mother who had fought for her child and won. Lady Pemberton was there in the crowd, and as Eleanor passed, the older woman nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement, if not quite approval. It was enough. The newspapers the next day would call it the Battle of Blackthorne Manor and a mother's triumph. They would dissect every detail of the case, debate Eleanor's character, question her past, but none of it mattered anymore. Because Thomas was hers, legally and permanently. No one could take him from her now. That night, after Thomas had been tucked into bed for the 3rd time and finally convinced to sleep, Eleanor stood at her bedroom window looking out over the grounds of Blackthorne Manor. She heard the door open behind her, felt Adrian's presence before he spoke. "You should be celebrating," he said quietly. "I am," Eleanor replied. "In my own way." Adrian came to stand beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Eleanor, we need to talk about what happens next." "I know." She turned to face him. "Adrian, you married me to help me win this case. You gave me your name, your reputation, your protection, and I'm grateful, more grateful than I can ever express. But now that it's over, I need to know, do you want to end this? The marriage, I mean. We could get it quietly annulled. You could be free to—" Adrian kissed her. It was not the gentle, ceremonial kiss from their wedding. It was fierce and claiming and full of 5 years of grief and longing and love that had refused to die. When he finally pulled back, they were both breathing hard. "I don't want to be free of you," Adrian said roughly. "I've never wanted to be free of you. Eleanor, I married you because I love you, because I've always loved you, because even when I thought you were dead, I couldn't stop loving you. And if you think I'm letting you go now, after everything we've been through, you're out of your mind." Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face. "I'm broken, Adrian. I'm not the woman you fell in love with." "No," he agreed. "You're stronger, fiercer, braver. You're the woman who came back from the dead and fought an entire society to protect a child who needed you. And I don't just love you, Eleanor. I'm in awe of you." "I don't know how to be a wife again," she whispered. "Not a real one. Jonathan and I, it was different, practical. I don't know if I can—" "Then we'll learn together," Adrian said simply. "We'll build something new, something that's ours. No more ghosts, no more past lives. Just us, moving forward." Eleanor looked up into his face. This man who had waited for her, who had fought for her, who had given her everything without asking for anything in return, and felt the last of her defenses crumble. "I love you," she said. "I never stopped, even when I thought I had to, even when I tried to. I love you, Adrian." His smile was like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. "Then say you'll stay. Say you'll be my wife in truth, not just in name. Say we can have the future we should have had 5 years ago." "Yes," Eleanor breathed. "Yes to all of it." When they finally went to bed that night, together, truly together for the first time, Eleanor felt like she was finally, completely home. Morning light filtered through the curtains of what was now truly their bedroom, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. Eleanor woke wrapped in Adrian's arms, his breathing steady against her hair, and for the first time in 5 years she felt something she'd almost forgotten existed. Peace. Not the fragile, temporary peace of exhaustion after battle, but the deep, settling peace of knowing the war was finally over. She lay still for a long moment, afraid to move and break the spell. But then Adrian stirred, his arms tightening around her, and when she looked up, she found him already awake, watching her with an expression so tender it made her throat ache. "Good morning, wife."
he said softly. Good morning, husband, she replied, and the word felt strange and wonderful on her tongue. A knock at the door interrupted them. Mrs. Jennings's discreet cough. Begging your pardon, your graces, but young Master Thomas is asking for his breakfast and wondering if you might join him. Eleanor smiled against Adrian's chest. Tell him we'll be down in 20 minutes. Very good, your grace. They dressed together in comfortable silence, though Eleanor was acutely aware of Adrian's eyes on her, the heat in his gaze that promised more quiet mornings like this one. When she caught him staring, he didn't look away. I'm memorizing you, he said simply. All the years I thought you were dead, I tried to hold on to your image in my mind. But it kept fading, like trying to grasp water. I won't lose you again, not even to time. Eleanor crossed to him and took his face in her hands. You won't lose me. I'm here. I'm real. And I'm not going anywhere. Thomas was indeed waiting for them in the breakfast room, already dressed and attempting to read the morning newspaper upside down. When they entered, he beamed and abandoned the paper immediately. Mama, your grace, Mrs. Jennings said you might sleep all day because you were very tired from yesterday, but I told her you wouldn't because you promised to take me riding today. Eleanor exchanged a glance with Adrian. She had made no such promise, but the hope in Thomas's eyes was impossible to refuse. Did I promise that? She asked, sitting beside him and stealing a piece of his toast. How careless of me to forget. You were very busy winning in court, Thomas said generously. Mrs. Jennings explained it all. She said Uncle Marcus is going to prison and can't ever bother us again. Is that true? It's true, Adrian confirmed, settling into his own chair. Marcus Hartley will face trial for kidnapping, extortion, and fraud. He won't be troubling anyone for a very long time. Thomas considered this while chewing thoughtfully on a piece of bacon. Good. He was mean to Mama and to Papa before he died. Papa used to say that Marcus had a hole inside him that could never be filled, no matter how much money he put in it. Eleanor's eyes stung. Jonathan had been a wise man in his quiet way. Your papa was right about many things. I miss him, Thomas said simply. But I'm glad I have you. And now I have his grace, too. He looked up at Adrian with sudden shyness. May I call you something besides your grace? It feels very formal for family. Adrian's face went soft in a way Eleanor had never seen before. What would you like to call me? Thomas thought hard. Not Papa. That was my father. But maybe Uncle Adrian, or just Adrian, if that's allowed? Adrian is perfect, Adrian said, his voice rough with emotion. And Thomas? I'm honored to be your family. Truly honored. They spent the morning riding across the estate. Thomas perched in front of Adrian on a gentle mare, while Eleanor rode beside them on her own horse. The winter sun was bright, the air crisp and clean, and Thomas's laughter rang across the fields like bells. Watching Adrian teach Thomas how to hold the reins properly, seeing the careful patience in his movements and the wonder in the boy's face, Eleanor felt something shift and settle in her chest. This was what family looked like. Not the performance she'd put on with Jonathan, loving but always slightly detached, always aware that she was playing a role. This was real, messy and imperfect, and absolutely real. When they returned to the manor, a courier was waiting with a stack of letters. Most were congratulatory notes from members of society who had apparently decided that Eleanor's victory in court made her respectable enough to acknowledge. Lady Pemberton's note was particularly interesting. Your Grace, while I cannot say I approve of the dramatic manner of your return to society, I must acknowledge that your dedication to the child is admirable. You have proven yourself a woman of strength and character. I would be honored if you and the Duke would join me for tea next week. There are several young mothers in my acquaintance who might benefit from your unique perspective on resilience. Eleanor read it aloud to Adrian, who laughed. High praise from Lady Pemberton. You've officially been welcomed back into the fold. I'm not sure I want to be in the fold, Eleanor admitted. These same people were calling me a fraud and a murderer 2 weeks ago. Then don't do it for them, Adrian said. Do it for Thomas. He'll need connections when he's older. Friends, allies, a place in society that isn't defined by scandal. Eleanor knew he was right, but the thought of sitting through endless tea parties and making small talk with women who had condemned her still made her stomach turn.
I'll think about it. The rest of January passed in a strange, peaceful blur. Eleanor slowly settled into her role as Duchess of Blackthorne, learning the household routines and meeting with the tenants and estate workers. They regarded her with cautious curiosity at first, but Thomas's open affection for her seemed to serve as an endorsement. If the boy trusted her, they would too. By February, invitations were pouring in. The scandal had transformed from a mark of shame into a mark of intrigue. Eleanor was no longer the questionable widow, but the woman who had defeated Marcus Hartley's schemes and won her child in court. Society loved a dramatic story, and Eleanor's had all the elements of a Gothic novel. She accepted some invitations and declined others, gradually building a small circle of genuine friends rather than mere acquaintances. Lady Pemberton, surprisingly, became something of a mentor, introducing Eleanor to other women of intelligence and substance who cared more about character than gossip. But it was a letter that arrived in early March that truly changed everything. Eleanor was in the library with Thomas, helping him sound out words in a picture book, when Mrs. Jennings brought in the post. One envelope stood out immediately, expensive paper, sealed with the crest of the London Medical Society. Eleanor opened it with trembling fingers and read, "Your Grace, we have followed your case with great interest, particularly the medical testimony regarding your recovery from amnesia following the Manchester railway disaster. We are conducting a study on traumatic memory loss and would be honored if you would consent to be interviewed for our research. Your experience could help countless other victims of similar accidents understand and cope with their own conditions. Additionally, we believe your testimony could help establish better medical protocols for treating head trauma in the future." Eleanor stared at the letter for a long moment, her mind racing. For 5 years, her amnesia had been a source of shame and suspicion, proof that she was unreliable, potentially fraudulent, a woman whose word couldn't be trusted. But this letter suggested something different. It suggested that her experience had value, that her suffering might help others. "What is it?" Adrian asked, looking up from his own correspondence.
Eleanor handed him the letter. "They want to study me, like I'm some sort of medical curiosity." Adrian read quickly, then looked at her with understanding. "Or like you're someone whose experience could change how we treat people with head injuries." "Eleanor, this is an opportunity. Not just for you, but for everyone who's ever been dismissed or doubted because they couldn't remember." "I don't want to be a specimen," Eleanor said quietly. "You wouldn't be. You'd be a teacher, an advocate." Adrian set down the letter and came to kneel beside her chair. "But only if you want to be. This is entirely your choice."
Eleanor looked down at Thomas, who was patiently waiting for her to finish reading so they could continue with his lesson. He looked up at her with complete trust, completely secure in the knowledge that she would always put him first, and suddenly she knew what she had to do. "I'll do it," she said. "Not just the interview, but more. Adrian, what if we established a fund, something to help people who've been injured in railway accidents, to provide medical care, financial support, help finding lost family members? The railways are making fortunes for men like Marcus, but what about the people who are hurt when things go wrong?" Adrian's eyes lit up. "The Hartley Memorial Fund, named after Jonathan to honor the man he was and the life he gave you and Thomas. Would that be possible? Could we actually do something like that? Eleanor, you're a duchess now, and I'm a duke with more money than I know what to do with. We can do anything we want." Adrian grinned. "And watching you turn your tragedy into something that helps others, that's exactly the kind of project I want to be part of." By the end of March, the plans were underway. Eleanor gave her interview to the Medical Society, answering questions about her recovery with an honesty that left the doctors visibly moved. One of them, a young physician named Dr. Shaw, asked her if she would be willing to speak to other patients struggling with memory loss. "Just to let them know they're not alone," he said, "that someone else has walked this path and come through the other side." Eleanor agreed and soon found herself visiting hospitals and charity wards, talking to people whose lives had been shattered by accidents and illness. She discovered she had a gift for listening, for making people feel heard and understood, and slowly her purpose crystallized. She wasn't just a duchess or a mother or a scandal. She was someone who had survived, and survival itself was a kind of expertise. The Hartley Memorial Fund was officially established on April 1st with an endowment from both Eleanor's inheritance and Adrian's personal fortune. The announcement made headlines, and this time the newspapers praised Eleanor as a philanthropist and advocate rather than condemning her as a fraud. But the most meaningful moment came when Mrs. Bradford traveled to London specifically to attend the fund's inaugural event. "Mrs. Eleanor," the older woman said, gripping Eleanor's hands tightly, "Mr. Jonathan would be so proud of what you've done, taking his memory and making it mean something good. That's a gift, Your Grace, a real gift." Eleanor hugged her fiercely. "None of this would be possible without you. You stood up for me when everyone else believed the lies." "I told the truth, that's all," Mrs. Bradford said gruffly. "Anyone with eyes could see you loved that boy and that man. Love like that doesn't fake itself." By May, Thomas's 6th birthday was approaching, and Eleanor threw herself into planning a celebration. Not a grand society ball, but something simpler. A party in the gardens of Blackthorne Manor with games and cake, and all the children from the nearby tenant farms invited to play. On the morning of his birthday, Thomas woke to find a gift on his bedside table, a small wooden box containing a pocket watch that had belonged to Jonathan. "Your father wanted you to have this when you were old enough to understand its value," Eleanor explained, sitting on the edge of his bed. "It was his father's watch, and his grandfather's before that. It's a Hartley family treasure." Thomas held the watch carefully, tracing the engraved initials with one finger. "Will I be a Hartley still, even though I'm part of a new family now?" Eleanor's throat tightened. "You'll always be Thomas Hartley. That's who your father named you, and that's who you are. But you're also part of the Blackthorne family now. You can be both. You can honor where you came from while building something new. Like you," Thomas said wisely. "You're Eleanor Ashford and Eleanor Hartley and Eleanor Blackthorne all at once." Eleanor laughed, surprised by his insight. "Exactly like me. We're complicated people, you and I." "I like being complicated," Thomas decided. "It's more interesting than being simple." The birthday party was a chaos of children and laughter and cake crumbs. Adrian proved surprisingly adept at organizing games, and Eleanor watched him chase giggling 6-year-olds through the garden with a mixture of love and amazement. This man, who had once been so isolated, so consumed by grief, had transformed into someone who could throw himself wholeheartedly into a child's birthday party. When the last guest had departed and Thomas had finally been put to bed, sticky with sugar and exhausted with happiness, Adrian found Eleanor sitting on a bench in the garden, watching the sunset. "You're thinking," he observed, settling beside her. "I'm remembering," Eleanor corrected. 5 years ago, I was on a train heading to London for the season. I was young and foolish and convinced that my whole life was mapped out perfectly. And then the train crashed, and everything I thought I knew was taken away." "Do you regret it?" Adrian asked quietly. "The crash, I mean. The years you lost." Eleanor considered the question seriously. "I regret the pain, the confusion, the time we lost together, but I don't regret who I became because of it. That girl on the train, she was softer than I am now, kinder, maybe, but also weaker. She wouldn't have fought for Thomas the way I did. She wouldn't have stood up to Marcus. She wouldn't have survived what came after. She was stronger than you give her credit for," Adrian said. "She had the courage to love me when society thought I was too serious and strange. She had the grace to see past my title to the person underneath." "Maybe," Eleanor conceded, "but I like who I am now better, scars and all." Adrian took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "Eleanor, there's something I want to ask you. The season is approaching, the summer season, with all its balls and parties. I thought, what if we did it properly this time? Not sneaking around, not hiding, but a real coming out as the Duke and Duchess of Blackthorne. A chance to show society exactly who you are and dare them to disapprove." Eleanor's first instinct was to refuse. She had no desire to parade herself in front of the same people who had called her a murderess and a fraud. But then she thought about Thomas, about the life he would grow up into, about the importance of claiming her place rather than hiding from judgment. "One condition," she said, "we host the first ball of the season at Blackthorne Manor, on our territory, by our rules. And we invite everyone, not just the aristocracy, but the doctors from the medical society, the women from the charity wards, Mrs. Bradford and Dr. Graham from Yorkshire. Everyone who helped us. I want to show them what their support meant." Adrian's smile was brilliant. "That's either the most audacious thing I've ever heard or the most brilliant. Possibly both. I seem to specialize in audacious, Eleanor said dryly. I did return from the dead, after all. The preparations for the ball consumed all of June. Eleanor threw herself into the planning with the same fierce determination she'd brought to fighting Marcus. This wasn't just a party, it was a statement, a declaration that she belonged here, that she had earned her place, that society's approval or disapproval no longer had the power to define her. When the invitations went out, society buzzed with speculation. A ball hosted by the Blackthornes, with a guest list that included common doctors and farmers alongside earls and viscounts. It was unprecedented, scandalous, absolutely irresistible. The night of the ball, Eleanor stood in her dressing room while a maid arranged her hair and another helped her into a gown of deep emerald silk that made her eyes look like amber flame. She studied herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back. This wasn't the frightened girl who'd disappeared 5 years ago. This wasn't even the desperate widow who'd walked into a Christmas ball in mourning clothes, ready to fight the world for her son. This was someone new, someone who had been broken and rebuilt herself into something stronger than before. A knock at the door, and Adrian entered. He stopped dead when he saw her, his expression making her heart race. "You're beautiful," he said simply. "You've always been beautiful, but tonight you look like a queen." "I feel like I'm going into battle," Eleanor admitted. "You are," Adrian said, "but this time you're fighting from a position of strength. You're not asking for acceptance, Eleanor. You're commanding respect. There's a difference." He offered his arm, and together they descended the grand staircase to greet their guests. The ballroom had been transformed, hundreds of candles in crystal chandeliers, flowers from the estate gardens arranged in towering displays, musicians tuning their instruments in the corner, and streaming through the doors, a glittering array of England's finest families. But Eleanor's eyes went first to the people standing slightly apart from the aristocratic crowd, Mrs. Bradford in her finest dress, looking overwhelmed but proud. Dr. Graham and Dr. Shaw from the Medical Society engaged in animated conversation with several titled lords about railway safety improvements. The women from the charity wards that Eleanor had visited dressed in borrowed finery and staring around with wonder. "They came," Eleanor whispered. "Of course they came," Adrian said. "You invited them. And more importantly, you made them feel welcome in a place that usually excludes people like them. That means something, Eleanor." The ball proceeded with all the usual rituals, the receiving line, the opening dance, the careful choreography of social interaction. But there was an undercurrent of something different, something electric. People were actually talking to each other across class lines, drawn together by Eleanor's deliberately mixed guest list and genuine curiosity. Lady Pemberton cornered Eleanor during a break in the dancing, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "This is either brilliantly strategic or utterly mad," she said bluntly. "I haven't decided which." "Can it be both?" Eleanor asked. Lady Pemberton laughed, a genuine sound of delight. "My dear Duchess, I believe it can. You've managed to do what few people accomplish. You've made charity fashionable without making it condescending. Half the women here are already planning their own fundraising events, trying to copy your style." "That was rather the point," Eleanor admitted. "If society is going to gossip about me anyway, I might as well give them something useful to copy." "Clever girl," Lady Pemberton tapped Eleanor's arm with her fan. "You've learned the game well, but tell me, are you happy, truly happy? Because all the social success in the world means nothing if you're miserable in your marriage." Eleanor's eyes found Adrian across the ballroom, dancing with Thomas balanced on his feet, the boys' delighted laughter carrying over the music. "I'm happy," she said softly. "Happier than I ever thought possible after everything that happened." "Good," Lady Pemberton said with satisfaction. "The Duke deserves happiness. He mourned you like Orpheus mourned Eurydice. I'm glad the story had a better ending this time." As midnight approached, Adrian called for silence and raised his glass. The ballroom quieted, hundreds of faces turning toward the Duke and Duchess. "Friends," Adrian began, his voice carrying across the space, "we gathered here tonight not just to celebrate the season, but to celebrate survival. 5 years ago, my wife was on a train that crashed, killing dozens of people. She should have died that day. By all logical accounting, she did die. Her name was on the list of the deceased, and I mourned her as such. Eleanor felt her throat tighten as every eye in the room fixed on her. But Eleanor Ashford didn't die, Adrian continued. She survived, and from that survival came something remarkable: a second life, a second chance, and the strength to fight for what mattered most. Tonight, we're not just celebrating her return. We're celebrating the Hartley Memorial Fund, which has already helped over 50 families affected by railway accidents. We're celebrating the changes to medical protocols that her testimony helped inspire. And we're celebrating the truth that sometimes the most broken people become the strongest advocates for healing. He turned to Eleanor, his eyes shining. To my wife, the woman who came back from the dead and reminded us all what courage looks like. To the Duchess, the crowd echoed, raising their glasses. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face, but she didn't care. Let them see her cry. Let them see her as fully human, not some untouchable aristocratic ideal. When the last guest had departed in the early hours of morning and the servants had finally been sent to bed, Eleanor and Adrian walked through the quiet manor hand in hand. They stopped in the portrait gallery, where Adrian's ancestors stared down from the walls with varying degrees of approval. Your portrait will hang here one day, Adrian said, gesturing to an empty space on the wall. The Duchess, who returned from death. They'll tell your story for generations. What story will they tell? Eleanor wondered. The scandal or the survival? Both, Adrian said. Because you can't have one without the other. The scandal made the survival meaningful, and the survival redeemed the scandal. It's all part of who you are. Eleanor leaned against him, letting his warmth seep into her bones. I used to think I had to choose who to be, Eleanor Ashford or Eleanor Hartley or Eleanor Blackthorne, but I'm learning I can be all of them at once, all the versions of myself, broken pieces and new growth and everything in between. Good, Adrian said, pressing a kiss to her hair. Because I fell in love with all of you, every version, every piece, the girl who died and the woman who lived, and everyone you've been in between. They stood together in the silent gallery, and Eleanor thought about the long, strange journey that had brought her here. The train crash that should have killed her, the months of confusion and pain, the practical marriage that had given her purpose, the custody battle that had nearly destroyed her, and finally, this, peace and love and a family built from the wreckage of loss. Somewhere in the manor above them, Thomas slept peacefully in his bed, secure in the knowledge that he was loved and wanted and safe. That was worth everything. Every moment of pain, every public humiliation, every terrifying night wondering if she'd lose him. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if the train hadn't crashed? Eleanor asked quietly. If I'd made it to London that day, to the season, if we'd courted properly and married 5 years ago like we planned? Adrian considered the question seriously. I think we would have been happy, but I don't think we would have been this happy. We were too young, too untested. We hadn't learned yet what really mattered. The crash, terrible as it was, taught us both that. It taught me that titles and duty mean nothing without love, and it taught you that you're strong enough to survive anything. Even you? Eleanor teased gently. Especially me, Adrian said with a smile. I'm very difficult to survive. 1 year later, almost to the day, Eleanor stood in the same ballroom hosting the second annual Hartley Memorial Fund Gala. But this time, she wasn't nervous or uncertain. This time, she moved through the crowd with the easy confidence of someone who knew exactly who she was and what she'd earned. The fund had grown beyond anything she'd imagined. They'd helped nearly 200 families now, provided medical care for dozens of injured railway workers, and successfully lobbied Parliament to improve safety regulations on the rail lines. The newspapers called Eleanor the People's Duchess and praised her advocacy work. But the moment Eleanor treasured most came not from society's approval, but from something much simpler. Thomas, now 7 and growing like a weed, gave a short speech at the gala about his father's memory and what the fund meant to families like his. He spoke clearly and confidently, and when he finished, the entire ballroom erupted in applause. Afterward, as they were preparing to leave, Thomas tugged on Eleanor's sleeve. Mama, I was thinking, when I grow up, I want to help people like you do. Not just with money, but really help them. Maybe I could be a doctor, or a lawyer who helps people who can't afford one.
Something that matters. Eleanor knelt down so she could look him in the eyes. You can be anything you want to be, Thomas. But whatever you choose, choose it because it sets your soul on fire. Choose it because you can't imagine doing anything else. Like you chose to fight for me? Thomas asked. Exactly like that, Eleanor said, pulling him close. That's what real choice looks like, darling. Not picking the easy path or the expected path, but the path that matters most to your heart. That night, lying in bed with Adrian's arms around her, Eleanor stared up at the ceiling and marveled at the strange architecture of her life. All the pieces that seemed broken and wrong had somehow arranged themselves into something beautiful and whole. What are you thinking about? Adrian murmured sleepily. I'm thinking about the train crash, Eleanor said, and how for years I thought of it as the worst thing that ever happened to me, the moment that destroyed my life. And now? Now I think maybe it was the moment my real life began. Eleanor turned in his arms so she could see his face. Everything that came before was just preparation. The crash stripped away everything that wasn't essential and left me with the truth of who I really am. Does that sound strange? It sounds like survival, Adrian said. Real survival, not just the physical kind. You didn't just live through the crash, Eleanor. You transformed because of it. And that transformation, that's what made you strong enough to fight Marcus, to build the fund, to become who you are now. Who am I now? Eleanor asked, genuinely curious what he would say. Adrian smiled in the darkness. You're the woman who returned from the dead, the mother who fought an entire legal system for her son, the duchess who refused to play by society's rules, the advocate who turned her tragedy into hope for others. You're my wife, Thomas's mother, Jonathan's legacy, and your own person all at once. You're Eleanor Blackthorne, and you're exactly who you're supposed to be. Eleanor kissed him, pouring 5 years of grief and love and gratitude into the gesture. When they finally pulled apart, she whispered, "Thank you for waiting for me, for never giving up, even when everyone said I was dead." "I would have waited forever," Adrian said simply. "Some loves are worth waiting for. Ours was worth everything." They fell asleep tangled together, and Eleanor dreamed not of train wrecks or courtrooms or battles, but of a future stretching out before her like an open road, full of possibility and purpose and love. The last snowfall of winter came in late February, blanketing Blackthorne Manor in pristine white. Eleanor stood at the same window where she'd stood the night of the Christmas ball over a year ago, watching the flakes drift down in the quiet darkness. But this time, she wasn't afraid. This time, she wasn't alone. Thomas was asleep upstairs, secure in the knowledge that no one would ever take him away. The Hartley Memorial Fund was thriving, helping more families every month. And Adrian, her husband, her partner, her anchor, was reading by the fire, occasionally glancing up to smile at her. A year ago, she had been a ghost returning to haunt the living. Now she was fully, completely, triumphantly alive. The past could not bury her. Society could not break her. And love, stubborn as winter itself, fierce as survival, stronger than death, had rewritten her fate entirely. Eleanor Blackthorne had died in a train crash in 1843, but Eleanor Blackthorne had also been reborn from those same flames, tempered by loss into something unbreakable. And she would spend the rest of her life proving that survival wasn't just about living through trauma. It was about building something beautiful from the wreckage. On Christmas Eve of 1849, Eleanor walked into the annual ball at Blackthorne Manor for the third time. But this time, she arrived not as a ghost or a scandal or a duchess fighting for acceptance. She arrived as herself, completely, unapologetically, radiantly herself. Thomas walked beside her in his finest clothes, tall and proud and utterly unafraid. Adrian held her other hand, his grip warm and sure. And as they entered the ballroom together, this patchwork family built from loss and love and sheer determination, the assembled guests didn't whisper or judge or condemn. They applauded. Because sometimes the best stories aren't about people who never fall. They're about people who fall, shatter completely, and then painstakingly rebuild themselves into something stronger than they were before. Eleanor had been the woman who should have stayed dead, the woman society wanted to bury twice, the woman everyone had written off as too damaged, too scandalous, too broken to ever truly belong.
But she had proven them all wrong. And in doing so, she had written herself a new ending, one where the woman who came back from death didn't just survive. She thrived.